Contaminants in the Hammer building. Sorry, guys. Okay. A couple of announcements that we need to go through, logistics. Thanks to everyone who did the discussion last week. Was it okay? Not too painful? I think about half of you did it. Yeah, was it okay? Thumbs up for those that it was okay? Yeah? Okay. Yeah.
So, if we do all four, will you take our best two grades or no?
No, just do two. Don't do more than you need to. Well, by all means do it, but I'm not gonna, you just need to tell me which one's the grade if you're going to do that.
Okay, so if we screw up one, like, we got a second chance.
You had two chances. I'm not going to take the best of four.
Well, I can tell you which
No, I mean, I'm not going to grade, I'm only going to grade two of yours. I'm not going to read four of yours, right? Because it's not fair for those who only want to just do two. It's not a best of, don't do all four and then I'll pick the best two. Just do two, yeah? And maybe read the other ones. Is that clear? You guys don't have to do all four, right? Okay. The next discussion is October 2nd. No, October 7th to the October 10th. And it's going to also overlap with your paper, which I'm sorry about, but that's the way life goes, I guess. So let's talk about the paper for a minute. Which class is this? Growth and Development. Okay. I have posted the paper assignment under assignments, right? This is it. It's a response paper. Is everything all right up there, guys? Is everything cool? Okay. The paper, oh, this is a little strange, sorry. It's 2,500, or it's 2,000 words, right? And you're going to write a response paper choosing a side. So what I've done is I've given you two papers, The Great Vitamin A Fiasco by Michael Latham, who has unfortunately passed away 2 years ago. He was at Cornell. He was a giant in international nutrition. And a standard care intervention practice done almost all over the world is vitamin A supplementation. Vitamin A supplementation has been around for 30 years, given to children ages 6 to 5 years of age, 6 months to 5 years of age, and they get 2 doses a year, high dose of vitamin A. And this has been integrated into all child health programs all over the world. Well, there's a lot of controversy about vitamin A supplementation and whether or not it improves infant growth, reduces infant morbidity and mortality. So Michael Latham wrote a piece called The Great Vitamin A Fiasco, talking about how the controversy of vitamin A supplementation, okay? In response to that, Keith West and Al Summer used to be the dean of Bloomberg Public Health School at Johns Hopkins. They wrote a response paper to that, saying that Michael Latham was basically an idiot, he was wrong, vitamin A supplementation has saved thousands and thousands of children's lives. And so I want you to read both papers and pick a side. So Latham's side says food-based approaches to improving vitamin A is the best thing, supplementation is wrong and is actually could be detrimental to children. And Keith West and Al Summer say that vitamin A supplementation is miraculous. And this has been a bit of an ongoing debate. And what's happened is that there's been some bigger research trials that have come out since then. I'm not going to name what it is because I want you guys to look that up. That have also sort of fueled this big fire in international nutrition. Okay, so you're going to read those pieces, do some more literature research to support one of the two sides. Some of you may fall somewhat down the middle. You might think that Keith West is sort of right, but Michael Latham might be right as well. If you do sort of fall down the middle, which is a harder paper to write, you have to be very clear on why both approaches will work. Okay? So the first thing you're going to have do is an annotated bibliography. An annotated bibliography should have, and that's due, I think it's due October 5th. Yeah? Someone said October 5th. I want you to send me 5 to 10 references that are relevant to your paper that you're going to write. So it's due a week ahead of time. Annotated bibliography is just the reference written in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition format, and then 2 or 3 sentences summarizing that article. Like, this study was a big randomized controlled trial that was done in India. They found that vitamin A supplementation killed a lot of children, whatever. So, and you're going to do that for 5 to 10 papers. Send that to me a week in advance. One, it's a way for you to practice what an annotated bibliography was. It's a certain style. It's a certain way for you to start thinking and formulating the ideas of your paper. Often, if you do a consultancy in the UN or you do a consultancy to write a big report, sometimes they ask you for an annotated bibliography first. So I just want you all to know how to do it. The first time I was asked to do that, I didn't even know what it was. What the heck is an annotated bibliography? So,
well, now they have to do that in their thesis settings.
Okay, so this is good practice for you. I've put up here how to prepare an annotated bibliography. There's a little PDF here of that to give you guidance. The response paper assignment is posted, and these 2 articles are posted. I've also given you some other references that you can look at and some media and the debate, a summary of the debate. I've also put up a rubric of what I'm looking for the paper that you can read over. And I think that's it. Any questions on the paper? It's fun. Fun in quotes.
She has a question.
Yeah.
Will we be having our orientation to EndNote, or is that after?
Oh, orientation to EndNote. Dr. Letterman, are you staring at your driver's license?
No, there's somebody listed here.
Oh, I don't know anything about that. Are you guys getting an introduction to EndNote?
Yes, they are.
Oh.
What was the question?
When are you getting the introduction? When are they getting the introduction?
There are 2 dates that you have to go to one or the other. You have to complete it. If you don't go to the sessions, you have to complete it by the date of the second session. They're both on Friday. I think they start next week. Does anyone else know? I can look this up if necessary.
But the EndNote is a way of you organizing your papers in a specific file management system.
And they should use that for all of their readings, because otherwise they'll be wanting to refer to a reading and they'll have to redevelop the proper citation all over again.
Yeah, I don't like EndNote, but if you guys want to use EndNote, hats off.
It's on October 3rd is one session and October 10th is the other.
So you don't really need that for this paper if that timing doesn't work out for you. But you guys do need to know how to go on PubMed. Have you guys gotten a lesson on PubMed?
That's the same thing. That day you have one session on EndNote, preceded by a session on how to search databases, including
This is
PubMed.
PubMed. I'll give you just a quick little, and it can get much more complicated. But this is a huge database that contains almost every paper related to health published, right? Dating way back. Being at Columbia, you get access to almost every journal. If you're outside of Columbia and you're just sitting at home and you don't log into the system through Columbia, you won't get the PDFs, because the way the library systems work, as you guys know probably from your undergrad, is libraries purchase all of these rights to access these journals. So you can do searches. So let's do Keith West. So you can do West, Keith, K, vitamin A. And you'll come up with 117 references that Keith West has been on. So, and then you can click on the article if it's interesting to you, and then you can download the article right here. So you just download it, the PDF, right? It's really easy. So PubMed gives you all the different authors. You can search by, you can say, Fonzo Agriculture. And you don't even have to do last names, right? You can just do Vitamin A India. Whatever you want, and you can do by keywords, you can do by last names, and you get lots of information. You can also click on article types, like if you just want to look at review articles or clinical trials. So if you just want to do review, you can click on the review. A nice other piece of PubMed is, let's say I'm looking at this biomarkers for nutrition. Sometimes PubMed's smart, and it'll give you a list of related citations, and so sometimes it's good to look over here as well. So you're going to need to be able to navigate PubMed to do your bibliography. Obviously, you guys know this is one of many databases, right? There's Web of Science. There's tons of social science databases, EconLit. There's tons of these.
I have told, the library has been told that we want you to learn about a variety of databases. If you're in that PubMed session, that EndNote literature searching, and then they only plan to be covering PubMed, ask them to show you other allied databases that would be of interest in nutrition particularly, because then they may go to some that would be very valuable for you to know about.
So yeah, if you go to Columbia Libraries, you can actually click really on anything, and like if you do PubMed, or you can see, if you click down here, you can go to a lot of different databases, and Columbia has them all. So, but the main thing that you guys want to learn, at least in the immediate term, is PubMed. That's going to get you to what you need. But you can look through the Columbia Library page and really put in anything under that quick search, and almost anything can come up. You can just search vitamin A, and it'll give you a laundry list of articles. Another great way of searching stuff, have you guys used Google Scholar? Google Scholar is really cool. I just want to show you one quick little thing, and then we'll move on to the Google Scholar. Is sort of becoming the go-to database even more than some of these more scholastic ones. If I do Fonzo, right, and I wanted to look up, monitoring the world's agriculture, here's a paper. But I wanted to just pull off the citation. See where I'm clicking where it says cite? If you guys click on that and hover over it, if you don't have EndNote right away, you can just take this, copy, paste it, and put it in your Word doc. It's a really quick way, so you don't have to type anything out. Got that, Dr. Letterman?
Yeah, except I don't know if it's AJCN style, which is what we asked
them
to do.
Yeah, but you don't have to type anything, really. You can just move stuff around thereafter.
Just to be aware of that, for your thesis, we asked that you use AJCN style.
Yeah.
The only thing that looked like it might not be the same is where the date is, and that it shouldn't be in parentheses in AJCN.
So, easy to do in Google Scholar if you don't want to type out your references, and you don't have something like EndNote to just pull everything out. Any other questions on the paper? So it's due October 14th, and unfortunately it kind of hovers around your midterm as well. But after your midterm, things are a little bit more easy sailing for you guys. You only have 2 more discussions, and then your final. You'll thank me later as you get itchy for the holidays. Okay. Any questions? No? Okay.
Do you know if this works? Is this yours?
That's Ariel's. Let me go through this really quick. Okay.
I wanted to put my slides up while you're talking. Can I do that?
Well, we can do it after, just because I'm in the course, which might be.
That's what I meant.
All right. So next week we're going to do a different style of lecturing. Dr. Letterman has spent the summer preparing for this one lecture. No. She did record a lactation and breastfeeding podcast. We want you guys to review that podcast. It's a 3-hour podcast before coming into class next week, okay? So if you go under Lecture 5, you'll find, oh, sorry about that. Let's go under Lecture Recordings. The podcasts, along with all the other ones from the classes, are here, if this ever loads. Come on. There's two links. Did all of you see my message? Maybe you saw it already. Why the heck is that?
And is it the vodcast or the
Okay, lactation lecture part 1 and part 2. We want you to watch these ahead of time, okay? You can just click right on the lecture and her podcast will come up. Should we listen to you for a second?
No. I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear it. I don't want to get me rattling the papers.
Yeah, it's
saying
It's never pleasant to hear yourself recorded. I always sound.
I actually was very eager to redo this podcast because I had done one about 4 years before, and it was the first time I'd ever done it, and I didn't realize the mic was right on the keyboard, and I was shuffling my papers, looking for things. That was.
The slides for the podcast are here, okay? And the required readings are all in here. Now, for the readings, I want you guys to read the textbook in full. Part of that. And instead of, you can read all of the readings if you want, but what we're going to do is assign readings to you by your TBL. Does everyone know what a TBL is? Don't say anything about it. What's a TBL? Oh, okay, good. Last year the students didn't even know what it was. So, do you guys know what TBLs you're in? No? Okay, so I've posted here your TBL groups. Thanks to Kendall.
Typed it, yeah. And she typed it.
Yeah, so you can find your name here, okay? So look to see which TBL you're in. And what else I've done is you'll see this TBL readings assignment. So for TBL groups 1 and 2, you're going to read the Bartik and Reinhold paper and the Letterman paper.
Oh, that's a lucky group.
Yeah. 3 and 4, Shack, Nielsen, and Leonardall. 5 and 6, Leonardall.
Leonardall.
Yeah, Barons. 7, Thulier and Leonard. 8, Thulier and Kramer. 9, Kramer and Nomsen Rivers. And then group 10 is McGuire and Nomsen Rivers. So the way we're going to do the discussion next week, we're going to have, the first part of the discussion will be Sally asking questions in your favorite style randomly on the podcast. So everyone should watch that and be prepared for that. Then we're going to ask that, when we're going to go into the papers, Sally's going to ask for you to by group, she's going to go into each of the papers and we'll have a discussion around those papers. Right?
My thought was that I would lead a discussion, and when issues came up that were related to a paper, I might ask the questions. So we'll see when they're actually in the class.
Okay, so...
Can I close up this and put the...
Any questions? So you need to do a bit more prep this time, readings and podcast. And then the following week, then we'll have a new lecturer, Eugene, who will be joining us. And we're going to move into children, infant children. And the vitamin A paper is really relevant for that stage. Do you want to go over the Q&A?
Yes. So we won't be getting on to the substantive yet. We're going to do the Q&A for today. and Jess will tell you who's going to be next. So who do we have for the first question?
Saima? Saima.
Okay.
How do you say it? Saima.
I looked at this and I have a note for you. I got an email from Wei Shen, who was one of the speakers at the Thursday session, and her email was listed wrong, so she wanted it corrected. It's going to be corrected on the sheets that you refer to identify mentors. But for those of you who might have been interested, please make a note that it's WS 2003, not 2004, at Columbia.edu. Okay, so the first question for her. What does the term fetal alcohol spectrum disorders mean?
Sally, is your mic on?
I believe so. Yeah. Thank you. Who was supposed to answer this? Yes. Yes, and speak loud.
There's symptoms associated with alcohol consumption during pregnancy. It can result in different abnormalities, but according to which one, there's different effects. So one, I know the first one is more severe than the others.
What is the one that's most severe called?
Fetal alcohol. Oh, I can't remember.
So what is that?
I can't
No,
remember.
don't look. And in fact, those of you who have the computers open, you should close them during the question period. You don't remember what it was?
Fetal alcohol spectrum disorder.
That's what I'm asking you about. That's not the most severe. Okay, let's call somebody else.
Anthony Joseph Basil.
Hi. So what is, if the most severe one is fetal alcohol syndrome, what are the symptoms of fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, and what does that mean?
So which one do you want to answer?
And answer the second thing. What does the term fetal alcohol spectrum disorders mean?
It's the range of effects that happen to the fetus when alcohol is consumed in pregnancy.
Okay, that's good enough. That's good enough. But you should all try to talk louder. I mean, I stand out here shouting with a microphone. You should you should shout from your seat. I mean, make believe you're at a football game and you're calling out to one of the players, you know. Okay, the next one is to whom?
Milan.
So what is the recommendation with regard to drinking during pregnancy? Don't drink at all. That's the recommendation. Okay, the next one?
Jennifer Chang.
Jennifer, where are you?
She's
Hi. When is the fetus most vulnerable to drugs or medications?
In the first 2 to 8 weeks.
For the very, very early in pregnancy, the first 2 to 8 weeks.
Amanda Chi.
Amanda, are lipid-soluble or water-soluble drugs more likely to enter breast milk in high concentration?
Lipid soluble.
Pardon?
Lipid soluble.
Okay.
Oh, you guys are great. Valerie.
Why is that true?
Because during lactation, there's more lipids in the breast, so they're
There's more lipids in the breast, so they're what?
moved more into the milk.
So they're moved more into the milk. It doesn't have to come from the breast. It can come from anywhere in the body.
Pregnant mother stores more, has more.
The pregnant mother has more fat stores, but it's really because there is more fat in breast milk, wherever that's coming from, and that makes things more, there's more fat in breast milk than there is in plasma. So whatever you have in plasma that's fat soluble has the possibility of transferring to breast milk and dispersing in the fat, and it's just driven by the solubility difference. The next person.
Tatiana.
Where is she? Hi. This is a somewhat complicated question, so if you try to figure out the pieces you can. What steps are needed for a drug to transfer from the mother's intake to the mother's breast milk?
So, the mother is exposed to the drug, and the drug goes into the blood, or
From where?
she takes she can take it, for example, orally,
Okay, let's deal with the oral drug.
oral drug, or another toxin. She's exposed to the drug, and the drug goes orally, goes to the blood, or the drug as the pollutants, organic, persistent drugs. They go to the fat, and then they go from the adipose tissue to the breast milk.
Okay, so I'm asking you about drug transfer, which you've now told me it can go from an oral dose into the blood. From where? Where is it? From the mouth to the blood? Where does it get absorbed into the blood?
In small intestine.
Say it louder.
Small intestine.
Okay, in the intestine. Okay, so now it's in the blood. How does it get into breast milk?
Through the placenta.
I didn't hear that.
Through the placenta.
So it goes from the blood to the placenta.
How does it go to the breast milk or to the fetus?
I asked how it went to the breast milk.
So it can go like from the mother's blood through the milk, but it is much lower than if it goes to the adipose tissue.
Okay. I'll let you end with it goes from the mother's blood to the milk. This is very important that you try to visualize these processes. And more than that you try to link in your mind whatever you learned in your science courses about facilitated diffusion, ordinary diffusion, activated transport. In other words, what are the processes by which something moves in the body? And at each step that you've talked about, so it goes in the mouth, it has to be absorbed. How does it get absorbed? Well, in some cases, it might be something not absorbable that's meant to treat the intestinal tract, and it's not absorbed. But for most things, they get absorbed. Where they get absorbed may matter, as you've seen with the micronutrients. Some are, what happens in the stomach is important. For others, they're absorbed high in the intestine, for others low. And those things may have implications for how they're processed later. But once they've gone through that, and they're in the blood, they go everywhere in the body. And in some tissues, substances get broken down into harmless compounds that get released. In other cases, they get transformed into something that may be the active form. For example, in terms of some of these vitamins, they may actually produce something that's more active than the original, as vitamin D. If you go through those processes of thinking about these when you're reading about them, you'll remember the stuff better. And it will also make much more sense to you, so you'll be quick in thinking when someone says, like, oh, that's going to transfer to breast milk. You might be thinking, well, why are they saying that? And then, well, it's fat soluble. And I've showed you the structures on the micronutrients just for this reason, that the structures of molecules will help to determine whether they're going to be fat soluble or water soluble. And that factor will help to determine where they end up in the body and whether they're stored in large amounts. Why is it that we need B vitamins more regularly than we need fat soluble vitamins? Because we have a limited amount of body water, essentially constant, and it gets flushed through the kidney regularly, and you lose water-soluble things. But the stuff that's sitting back, relaxing in the fat, isn't being excreted in your urine. So I went through this the way I did, particularly to get you to start trying to think mechanistically whenever you're reading about someone or something. So I told you, I think at the last lecture, how when I was studying vitamin D and I read about vitamin D-resistant rickets, and it just put this red flag up in my head. How could you have a rickets that was vitamin D resistant? And then it turned out we learned that the kidney was needed to hydroxylate and activate the vitamin D that people thought was the active ingredient. And those things, because when you start trying to figure out how things work, you end up understanding this stuff much better. Let me go on to the next question.
Esther.
Yeah, what are persistent, what does it mean when we say a persistent organic pollution or a pollutant or a POP?
POP is, so it could be derived from things that we make. It's like, or it could be also
Okay, so I asked you a very narrow question, which let's say this was where the answer was, and you started from here and went there. I asked you about what is a persistent organic pollutant, and you could answer that question by thinking of the name.
The pollutant that keeps accumulating in your body if you're exposed to it.
Does it have to be in your body to be a persistent organic pollutant?
No, it's just constantly in your environment.
In the environment, okay. So the name tells you something, that it has to be something that persists, so it's endurable. It's organic, which you haven't mentioned, so it means it's not something like lead or mercury. It's an organic compound, and it's a pollutant, meaning that we think is probably harmful, and it shouldn't have been wherever it is, whether that's just in the environment or actually in your body. And the thing about it is, it's not, that term does not mean it's a pesticide. Some people come to the conclusion that because many pesticides are persistent organic pollutants, that all persistent organic pollutants are pesticides, and they are. That's not true. Not all of them are persistent pesticides. Not all are persistent. Not all are organic. And you might argue whether they're all pollutants. So,
Mahima.
hi. Polybrominated diphenyl ethers are 10 to 100 times higher in some countries than they are in other countries. Where are they notably high? And then if you can answer that, I'll ask you why they're high. In the U.S. and in Europe? And why are they high?
Because of industrialization.
I can't hear you.
Industrialization.
Tara Elizabeth Dowd.
Where is she? Hi, Tara. Polybrominated diphenyl ethers are 10 to 100 times higher in some countries than others. Where, can you name countries where they differ, one where it's high and one where it's low? I can't hear you.
I would think that I would look against whether it's like a pest or
I can't hear you. I have a roar back here going, shh.
Yeah, it's just really intense here, so we can't hear you.
And this is going to happen to you in other settings, so don't feel that it's just here. How about you stand up and you shout at me? You can stand up for a minute. We'll just practice this to show you what it would be like. No, because this is what you need to develop the ability to do this. I'm sorry to pick on you. But let's use an example. Stand up. First of all, when you stand up, it's easier to talk loud, which is one of the reasons I tend not to sit when I lecture. Okay, now tell me, what countries might the levels of this be 10 times or 100 times higher than in other countries? I can't hear you.
I thought it was it's highly industrial. I thought it was Japan.
You can't name a particular country. For example, how does the U.S. we tend to be higher or lower than, for example, Europe?
Higher.
Why are we higher? Can't hear you.
I don't know.
You don't know. That's a good answer. It's an accurate answer. Okay, just give me another name.
Joseph.
Which Joseph which?
Oh, Joseph Achacoso Gancaiko.
All right, Joseph, are you going to show us that you can sit all the way in the back because you can talk so loud? Why, it is correct that the U.S. is higher than Europe. Can you tell me why that is? The levels of the PBDEs, the polybrominated diphenyl ethers.
More industrial waste pollutants.
So, no, does anyone want to volunteer an answer on this question? Yes.
PBDs are usually found in furniture, and so there's a policy, as I know at least in some states, that have a 3-second rule that says that if you hold like a flame to furniture, it can't burn.
Ignite.
Yes.
It must not ignite.
Right. So then, I guess manufacturers will put PBs in the furniture so they don't ignite.
And why isn't that true that happened in Europe?
I don't know the about
Okay. All right. Well, this was covered in the article, and there's some general principle here that's worth knowing about. PBDEs have multiple congeners. It depends on the number of bromines and all. I'll be talking about this later. And what happened was it was recognized that the ones that were more heavily brominated were more enduring and more polluting. And so they were declared unusable in Europe a long time ago, so that they wouldn't create this thing of they're persistent, they're organic, they're a pollutant, and they're going in every home. We ended up where we had that until very recently, much more recently than in Europe, where we finally outlawed them. But now we have also outlawed the lower congeners. I think this one, the 1 brominated to 5 brominated, which Europe declared not usable very, very long ago. Our justification was for what she said, that we wanted fabrics in homes not to be flammable. But we were doing it with something that was hazardous to health. And so it took very long here, and this is typical of a lot of different issues in foods and in pollution, that our regulations are very strongly influenced by our national view that manufacturers can do what they want until we show that what they're doing is really harmful. And that's not true, certainly not to the same extent in England. I mean, in Europe. So, for example, we have a major problem to this day about lead-based paint in older homes because we did not outlaw lead in paint until much, much later than we should have. And those homes last, 50, 100 years, and as they do, the paint deteriorates and kids get exposed to lead, and it has a very adverse effect. In Europe, they decided that they were not going to allow lead to be used in paints. When the issue first came up, that it was realized that lead kept white paint white longer because it does flake off and it reveals a new surface on a very molecular level, so it looks white. But they didn't declare and say that it couldn't be made because of that. They did it because of the people who would be working in the paint plants. And they said if they were using lead to mix into paints, those workers would be exposed to lead. And on that basis, they said it's not worth it. We said, well, the industries can take care of that. The unions can take care of that. That'll be handled by business. And, well, I don't know that we had a terrible effect on people working in paint plants. But, meanwhile, they were put into every home in the nation. And I've seen talks on this in the past. And they actually had ads recommending to you that you paint your child's crib with a lead-based paint, that you paint the toy box with a lead-based paint, that you paint the bedroom with a lead-based paint with the idea that it was easily cleaned because of this fact that it would come off. And so we have really destroyed the brains of hundreds of thousands of children who, because of the lead in the environment they're in, have measurable decrements in IQ. At one time, we used to think, I don't remember what the units are now, but 40 units of lead in the blood was above the level that was permitted. And then when they saw the huge effect on IQ it had, if you had it that high versus lower, they started to lower it. And they lowered it to the point where the medications that could be given to lower it could not lower it below this level. Then they stopped lowering the standard. But it's been definitely shown that even within the range that we permit, you have effects on IQ all the way down. So my point on this somewhat lengthy diversion is that policy makes a very big difference in terms of what happens to people's exposures to pollutants. And if you are interested in making changes in exposure, one of the things you might consider is how can you change policy. Give me another name.
Mary.
Mary? We got a Mary here? Going once?
Mary Handel.
Oh, that's me. Right.
Oh, there was another one.
Sorry.
Yeah, I go by
your
your
middle
name.
name.
Oh,
Sorry about that.
so she's next?
Yes.
Now,
Sorry.
something's been mentioned about the way in which pollutants get into the mother's body. But in thinking in more epidemiologic type terms, what factors do you think might determine the mother's body burden of POPs, persistent organic pollutants? So if you want to identify, I had a whole bunch of women here, I'm going to say she's probably at more risk than her, and she's maybe at more risk than her, and I'm basing it on some criteria. What might they be?
Well, I would think how much body fat they have, because the organic pollutants tend to be stored in body fat, and fat stores are mobilized during kidney function because serum levels of the pollutants in the determine how much the fetus gets during pregnancy.
I'm talking about the body burden. Don't go off on an allied topic. Just how much I have in my body. What might have determined it?
Oh, the fat level.
Okay, fat is one. What else? I mean, if you have a bunch of equally fat people and they differ in levels, what would you say they might indicate as cause?
How much they're losing weight.
How much what?
How much weight, if they're losing weight or not.
Nothing else? There's no other things that you would say that's a risk factor for more toxin in your body?
Oh, if you're working in an industry where you can
Okay,
exposure.
so that's exposures, yes.
Yeah. And if you're eating fish, like predatory fish.
So the diet
Yeah, the diet.
would matter. So people equally fat, depending on what they eat, might differ. What else?
Where they live, like if they're living in.
Geographic location,
Yeah.
because obviously that would determine if they're exposed. You've got to remember that. Okay, so another one is age. She's breathing a sigh of relief. Another one is age, because as you get older, you accumulate more. If you're eating it and you're being exposed to it, you're accumulating more. One that might have come to mind right away is how many babies you breastfed. Because if you're old and you're fat, but you've breastfed 8 children, you likely have a very low body burden. Next one.
Merrick?
Gee, it's interesting, right near each other. Do you know what the WHO recommends with regard to exposure of contaminants in breast milk? What is their conclusion about what should be done considering the exposures that come from breast milk?
I believe they want to make awareness policy.
They want to make what?
An awareness policy.
Okay.
About contaminants. Avoiding some dietary sources like meat, dairy, and fish will decrease those dietary intake of those things.
And what do they recommend about breastfeeding?
They recommend to keep breastfeeding because it outweighs the possibility of risks.
That's the answer to the question. Okay. So although there's a recognition that breast milk can contain contaminants that the mother's exposed to, you should be aware that all of the studies of the benefits to children of breastfeeding have been done with mothers who are exposed to a whole array of things and have them in their breast milk. They are done on populations all over the world. And despite the effects of these pollutants that probably would be an advantage not to have there, you still get these beneficial effects. So the WHO recognizes that, and while they don't think the answer is to just ignore pollution, they do say that despite the pollution, breastfeeding is best. Another one?
Name Zhao? Jane?
Hi. Why is it unethical to do a randomized control trial comparing one or more drugs to a placebo in a pregnant woman? Why is it unethical to do a randomized control trial comparing a drug to a placebo in a pregnant woman?
Because it's harmful to the baby.
Someone back there wants to know what you said.
Because it's harmful to the fetus
Because it is harmful for the fetus?
and others.
What if it's a harmless drug? We think we have a harmless drug and we want to test whether it's beneficial in some way or helps the mother's health because she has a disease.
Catherine. Keep power.
I think it's unethical because if it's beneficial, then the control population is being denied treatment, and if it's not beneficial, then you could be causing harm to the fetus.
Okay, you gave a good complex answer. she's saying that giving a placebo to the other group would not be good if you're treating a disease and they're not getting medication that is beneficial. But generally speaking, you're doing a randomized control trial when you don't know if it's truly beneficial. But then the key point that she made is correct, that you are exposing the fetus or the neonate or both to a drug where you're trying to establish if the drug is harmful. And people feel that doing that to a fetus who has a much higher probability of being vulnerable, and if they are, the effects can be lifelong devastating in a way that might not be true in adults, that's why they're rarely done. And it is one of the things that limits our ability to state unequivocally whether something is damaging or not in children. There are a lot of drugs on the market that have not been tested in pregnancy or in breastfeeding because of this concern, and it's not good that we then have limited information. I think we'll stop here. So the in planning this, does everybody relaxing now? In planning this lecture, it's really a challenge to plan a lecture on exposures, because the exposures, I would probably end up finding a list of 10,000 things that you're exposed to that people might be concerned about you being exposed to during pregnancy or breastfeeding. So I'm not going to be giving you that kind of comprehensive presentation of all the risks and what we know about them. But I'm going to do two things. First of all, I'm going to talk to you in general about some things you should be thinking about when you are thinking about exposure. So there's some generalities, and then I'm going to select, I think it's 5 substances which are common and which represent different types of exposures, and then look at what we know about them. So when I'm talking about them, I want you to be doing that kind of thinking of saying, okay, if you're talking about mercury, which I'm not going to be talking about, would this be similar if it was iron or lead or copper or magnesium? So this is an example, not just an indication of the particular substance's particular harm. So I'm going to be talking a bit about maternal and paternal exposures as well as fetal and why they might matter. The roots of exposure, which people rarely think about unless sort of pushed to do it. Some of the things that might determine the effects of exposure. Then I'll go through this list of examples that I mentioned and try to put the exposure hazard into some kind of context and scale. And then talk a bit about the wide range of exposures along the way. So, if you are exposed to something that is noxious, it can have any or all of a variety of effects. It can affect maternal and paternal health and, for example, fertility. So you may have something that if you were exposed to it, the likelihood of a pregnancy, whether you're the father or the mother, is lowered. And that might never be picked up because nobody's studying it, but let's say in a given factory where everybody is being exposed to something in the air, eventually people might say, gee, a lot of us ladies have been trying to get pregnant now for years. And, before I worked here, I got pregnant twice in a row, 12 months apart. And now I've been trying to get pregnant for 5 years and I haven't. And sometimes something like that starts people investigating, and that's how we find out that some exposure affects fertility. You can also have exposures that are perfectly benign for the mother, but then affect the fetus and possibly the newborn in ways that may be only in terms of physical growth, but sometimes in terms of cognitive and physical development. And in some cases, you have ones, which I'll be talking about, one of them, that had very definite long-term effects on the offspring, while seeming to have really, at the time, no effects on the mother, although some limited number of cases have been shown to also affect the mother in that case. Most of the time, they're very hard to link with the cause, and that makes this whole area a complicated one to be in. The March of Dimes, where I adapted the slides from, has a saying, to get ready for pregnancy, think of every day for someday. So they want you to get early periconceptional care, education and care, and I think I've spoken about that before, and ensure optimum nutrition so that you come into pregnancy with adequate weight and reserves. Ideally, you should be biologically mature, eliminate harmful habits, and then control diseases. And I think I mentioned these now that I put in the preconceptional piece into the first lecture. I've mentioned before how many of the pregnancies in the U.S. are not planned. Here's a slide showing it. We have a large number ended in abortion, which is a symptom of the fact that we have so many pregnancies that are not, people are getting pregnant when they don't want to. Yes?
You mind talking to the mic?
Am I not loud enough? Can you hear this better now?
Is it on?
The battery must be dead. By the way, thank you for speaking up.
Sally, there's batteries on that
I
side.
think it wasn't on. So I had moved it to off mute. Now you can hear me, right? That sounds much louder. Too bad it wasn't on when I was talking before. I hope that didn't make it difficult. Boy, this is much louder, isn't it? But now I can hear an echo. So here you have this large number of pregnancies that are ended in abortion, but meaning that people weren't preventing pregnancy to the extent we'd like. We have these that were born but unwanted. That always bothers me, that people have babies they don't want. And then you have the ones where people are saying, well, we thought we might have a second child, but we really didn't want it 18 months apart. So they're mistimed, and that may mean they create more problems within the relationship. So in this case, only 43% were really what we call intended. And when you think of that, you can see why you would say every day for some day, because for so many women, some day is going to come up without them having thought much about it. In terms of paternal effects of exposures, some of the common biomarkers used are things like sperm count. And if there is a difficulty getting pregnant, the man in the relationship may have a sperm count done where they will look at things like velocity, motility, viability, and whether their shape of the sperm is normal or not. There are a number of things that have been shown to affect sperm count, motility, mobility, and morphology, and you can read them for yourself, lead is among them, and radiation. So it is possible to affect fertility by having the man be exposed to things that are damaging. Now I have two examples here, and I believe I have a significant amount of information that I want to pass on. Yeah. So dibromochloropropane, that is used to kill nematodes, and it was for a long while used for soil fumigation. And listen to the list of foods: cucumbers, summer squash, cabbage, cauliflower, carrots, snap beans, okra. And then a number of plants: aster, shasta daisy, lawn grasses, and ornamental shrubs. Now it's only allowed for use for pineapple in Hawaii. And water levels are checked, and they're limited. You have to keep the water levels below a predetermined level. What they had found was that workers on plantations and in manufacturing plants had developed sterility, and that was what got it to be where they began to limit it. It is still used as a solvent for resins and gums and waxes. It's used in some waterproofing preparations, in making dyes and some drugs, and it is a pesticide for grains and fruit. So this is one example of how we have identified substances that are harmful for reproduction by identifying them in work sites where it's very limited what the exposures might be, and then they are able to check on the few that are there and eventually potentially identify which one was the cause. Now, another one that has been shown to be detrimental is dioxin, and many of you may have heard of it. I've heard it refers to as the most toxic material created, but I think that's somewhat of an exaggeration. There was an industrial explosion in the 1970s in Italy, and it caused very wide damage to the countryside and the population. But and dioxin levels were very high in the material when it exploded. And they noted a birth of excess daughters after the accident for workers who were exposed to the dioxin, and that ended up being confirmed in some other studies. So that was another one that we now think of as something we don't want to have people exposed to, and it's formed in general in fires and burning places. So there's always concern when you're burning refuse or garbage that dioxin may be produced, and it's persistent, it's organic, it's a pollutant. It goes into the area around the place where the burning occurs, and people can get exposed that way. So what are the various ways that the things that determine whether an exposure has an effect? In part, it may be how it enters the body. Certainly, in terms of the effects on the baby, it depends on the timing during fetal development. The other thing is dose and chronicity. The importance of that is that if you have to give a certain medication to a mother, you might consider whether you can do a lower dose or a shorter period of time, whereas in a non-pregnant woman, you might say, well, it's really better if we do this for 4 weeks because then we're absolutely sure we've dealt with it. But the evidence tends to show that 95% of people are better in 2 weeks. That might be worth knowing. And then for a pregnant woman, you might limit it to 2 weeks, and then if you only go on with the dosing if the medical condition really calls for it. Certainly for chronicity, I mean, there are a lot of things that Americans take on a chronic basis because they think they're helpful for them, but which they don't have to take if they realize there's a new negative that is associated with it. And that's something like aspirin. There are some people who are on aspirin very regularly to prevent relatively minor problems, but aspirin has a number of effects during pregnancy that you might want that to stop on a chronic basis. A person says, oh, but I get these pains, well, they may be able to take care of it in another way, another drug or a non-drug way, but also if they take it intermittently, occasionally, that may be much less of a problem than if they're taking it daily. We have very little way of studying what happens if you have concurrent exposures or you have multiple things that people are being exposed to in the course of the same pregnancy, even if they're not on the same day. And those are issues to keep in mind, that whereas one substance may have a big effect, 2 or 3 might accumulate to have a very serious effect. And then above and beyond all of this, we will always think that there's the genetic vulnerability. And in fact, when I was doing the thing covering neural tube defect, that was in this class, right? Did I do neural tube defect here? Yeah. Get confused because I'm working in the other course too. That if you remember, I showed you graphs where when they introduced either fortification or they did dietary supplementation or they did the use of a vitamin with folate in it, that all these bars went down. The rate went from high to low, but they didn't get down to 0. And they got down to a level that was common across almost every site that they included there. And that may represent genetic vulnerability, so that there's some cause of neural tube defect that is essentially wired into the genes of some people, and it's not necessarily related to folate at all. And so with any pollutant, that can be that some individuals would be particularly vulnerable to it. Now, in terms of the routes of entry, I think that everyone we've talked about during the question period was oral. We were talking in general because that's what most people think of, and probably most pollutants, that's the most hazardous route into the body. And that means you can get it from components of foods, like beverages, your tap water, and obviously drugs and medicines. But you can also get exposed to toxic substances through the lungs. And, one of them might be marijuana. You're breathing that in, and if the substance has even the substances that are in it that you expect to be in it are getting into your body, but there are also things that might be in it that you don't expect, and that can be quite toxic. So whatever you're breathing in, and particularly like if you're in a place where the air is heavily polluted, you're getting pollution through your lungs. But then you have the additional ones of things that can get in through the eyes, and that includes medicines that are applied to the eyes, or through the skin. And skin is not thought of so much. At one time, very long ago, there was a big thing about, I think it's DMSO. Does anyone know what that stands for? Yes, dimethyl sulfoxide. Is that it? And it's a substance that, if you put it on your skin, it enters the body very quickly, and it can be used to get other things into the body. And it was being used in some kind of casual way at one time. But it really made me think of the fact that you don't think of your skin as porous, but it is. And there are things that even if they're in your, for example, your shower water, might get into your body through the skin. But more than that, I think I'm intrigued by how many things people put on their skin and get to their skin because they're putting them, for example, on their hair. And I don't think that very many people, when they're spraying, their hairspray, or when they're dyeing their hair, or putting on lipstick and rouge and so on, all of which are going on the skin, that they're thinking about whether they're exposing themselves to something that might be toxic. And once you become aware of that, you start to think like, I wonder, is lipstick regulated? Do they make sure that one of these new ingredients that makes it last all day doesn't make it kill you in the process? But these are dark night thoughts. Oh my God, I'm using that stuff and it's new and who knows what's in it. So I'll give you some examples that make you see why you can get crazy about this. But just keep in mind that there are different routes of exposure, and some of them are very prominent in our mind, but others are not. Now, how do noxious substances get into food or drink? And by the way, we can say it's a toxic substance, but it is not correct to say it's a toxin. I'm talking about toxicants. That is the correct term. And you'll very often see people in writing as well as orally saying, there's all kinds of toxins in your body. Toxins are bacterial products only. What a bacteria produces that hurts you is a toxin. So if I slip up, you can correct me, but I should be talking about toxicants or toxic substances. So there are a lot of substances in the environment that we know are not good for us. And, there are things, for example, like mercury. But here are nitrates, which we use to fertilize yards. Solanins, which are in a number of vegetables. Things like celery and the green part of potatoes we have solanins in them. There are a lot of other things that do. There are mushroom poisons, which most of us know. I used to do gathering of wild edibles, but I never, ever gathered mushrooms because I was not willing to be sure that it wasn't poisonous. And then unprocessed soybean and rapeseed. Rapeseed is what you get canola oil from, but the rapeseed itself is toxic, but the oil is not when they've processed it. Fava beans, especially in large quantities, are known to produce the disease referred to as favism, which has occurred when people were really limited as to what they had access to in times of hunger, and they ate a lot of them. They got the condition. And some of the cabbage family vegetables are goitrogens. So if you were eating nothing but that, which if you're going through a winter on your reserve of food, you might get down to almost the only thing you had was cabbage, and you eat it all toward the end of the winter, and that can be a problem. So these are natural. Then you have the things that we put into foods, or we put into the ground in some way that can get in food, and we know we're doing it. And so pesticides and additives and salt are examples of natural, intentional components that might not be good for you, great for you. And then we have possibly a vaster number of environmental contaminants that are not intended to be in food and water. And interestingly, the use of persistent organic chemicals was often promoted with the idea that they did not break down very readily and that they weren't water soluble sometimes. But as a result of them not breaking down readily, they built up in the environment, and if the levels get high enough, they get high even in water. So these were never intended, and the dioxins and furans are examples of that. PCBs and PBDEs, which I think I'll be talking about more. Phthalates, some of you may have heard of them. They've been in the news on and off in the last few years. And then standard chemicals such as used in a lab, like benzene and toluene and so on. And then I have 3 elements, mercury, lead, and arsenic, all of which have been the source of news stories related to concern about their high levels in some people in some geographical areas. You also have toxic ingredients that can be created or added during preparation. Interestingly, we've gone very deeply into the idea of barbecuing food, and one of the things that barbecuing does is it increases the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, the PAHs in food, and there are ways of barbecuing to reduce that. If you're into it, you should find out what they are. Heterocyclic amines, aflatoxin this aflatoxin is the product of a mold, and it is a problem particularly for peanuts and peanut butter. The levels are regulated. It causes liver cancer, but it is developed in the course of preparing the peanuts for sale to get them into a condition where they can be sold. So typically they're going to be picked, and if they're moist, they may grow mold. They have to be dried, and if the drying conditions aren't good, they may develop aflatoxin. Trying to think of some other examples here. And then we repeatedly have examples of substances that are added or are natural in a product that are not recognized as hazardous until something happens. And I'm going to tell you a little story about this because it's a personal one I heard. I was very young at the time. I was working for the FDA very long ago when I first graduated from college, and I was an analytical chemist. And there were people who were the inspectors of foods, and they would identify samples that needed to be tested based on certain principles. So one of the inspectors came in. As he walked through the lab, he stopped to talk to me, and he told me, "You won't believe what I ran into today." They were federal employees, so they typically only inspected things that were produced that went into interstate transport. But for some reason, he was investigating someone who turned out to be a local supplier of soda. So the man only sold locally in his area, and he made the soda himself, just as you can. I don't know what the product is called, but there's these glass bottles I've seen at friends' houses with a metal cap, and you can put something in it, and it puts carbon dioxide in it, and it makes it bubbly, and you can get your seltzer for much less, apparently, and some people do that. So he was doing that, but he was making soda because he was flavoring it. And the guy sees on the shelf a box labeled Coumadin or something equivalent, and he says, "Why do you have Coumadin here? What is Coumadin used for?" Does anyone know medically what it's used for? Yes. It's a blood thinner. It is an anticoagulant, which is a more specific term than a blood thinner. So it's an anticoagulant. It's used medicinally when you have to have people who are likely to form clots. They get on a blood thinner or an anticoagulant. Coumadin is one of the things that was used. So I asked the man what he used it for, and he says, "Oh, that's a vanilla flavoring." Well, it turns out it does have a flavor if it's similar to vanilla. And he was using it to flavor his home-brewed soda pop. And so the inspector doesn't have any authority for this local guy, but he says to him, "You can't use that. It's it's a medicine. It's an anticoagulant." And then he said to me, and I thought, what am I going to do? I mean, he's probably going to keep using it if it's cheaper than vanilla, So he notified the local authorities and kept his fingers crossed that they would follow up on it. But what this brought to mind, I mean, at that time I knew very little about this aspect of the world. But think about it. He was giving an anticoagulant to all of these regular consumers of his product. What was the likelihood that someone had something happen because they were taking an anticoagulant when they shouldn't? The answer would be it would depend on the dose. So how much soda of his did they use in a year? It would depend on their health, because if they were, let's say they were bleeding internally a little bit, they might not realize their stool shouldn't be that dark, but if their intake, if they were a man, and so their intake needs aren't as high anyway, that might not matter. And then the next thing is, if they weren't in an accident, because when it really matters how your blood clots is when you're in an accident. So the guy who gets hit by a car and whose blood doesn't coagulate well is dead before he gets to the hospital. Who would ever think his soda might have explained it? Nobody. So you can have things like this going on in an environment that never get picked up, because even though they may have very detrimental effects. Ma Wang is another interesting one, because there was a growing appeal of, I'd say, Chinese medicine and what was used in the course of my life. And there was a point in my life when I never heard of Chinese medicine, and then you gradually heard of more and more and more. And the attitudes were very much that anything that was used in Chinese medicine has been tested for thousands of years, and you can be pretty sure that it's not harmful. Well, that's an incorrect approach, because Chinese medical people give out medications very differently than people here take them. So if you have, let's say you have something that will raise blood pressure, and it's a value for older people whose blood pressure has gotten very, very low, and it's causing them problems. So you might give them something that would raise their blood pressure, let's say like Ma Wang, and you would monitor the change in pressure. And based on that, day after day, they might visit that patient in their home and find the proper dose and take into account the variability of the amount of active principle, that the amount of active principle is variable in natural products, and that you have to monitor people in order to avoid over or underdosing. It's a very different process than going into a health food store, taking a bottle of, say, Ma Wang, going home and thinking, oh, that made me feel better, let me take another. And then, oh, let me take another. And it's harmless because it's Chinese medicine, so it's harmless. So Ma Wang came out as a dietary supplement here. And I don't know, how many of you know what the Dietary Supplement Act has done? I mean, what does it regulate, or how does it regulate? Does anyone have familiarity with it at all? If I don't ask you to tell me, can you raise your hand if you have some knowledge of the Diet Supplement Act? Okay, so it isn't widely known. It was passed in 1994. At that time, I was working at the downtown campus, and when I heard it come out, I had not been aware this was happening, and I read it, and I said, this can't be. This essentially has gutted the Food and Drug Act, which was the basis of the formation of the Food and Drug Administration. What it says is if you sell what I would call a drug, any chemical, and you sell it as a dietary supplement, you don't have to prove that it's effective, and you don't have to prove that it's safe. So when you see something that's being marketed as a dietary supplement, you can say, okay, this is either equivalent to water or poison. How much do I want to take? Because that's what the range is. And with Ma Wang, they had to have a series of deaths before FDA could go to court and argue that it had to be taken off the market. So in that case, the effects were relatively dramatic and relatively short. That is, they came up when the people who died, they came up in a reasonably short period of time, so people did relate it to what they were taking. But for many things, it would be toxic over time, damage your liver. You know, instead of getting liver failure at 90, you get liver failure at 70, or you have some other organ that doesn't function very well. But you know, in any population, there's always some people where the organ doesn't function very well, and only perhaps when people pick up that why is it that we have this increase in kidney failure in people under 40, which used to be 1 in 10,000, and now it's 8 in 10,000. Well, you'd have to have a lot of good data to be able to pick up something that was, 1 in 10,000. But that's the type of thing that could be happening because of exposures to substances that are not beneficial and are actually harmful. Now, I have this which will be in the slide set that you get. And I'm not going to go through it in detail. I just want you to see that there are many common plant toxicants, but they're at low levels in foods. But when I used to ask the nutrition class early on in the program, I used to ask them, why do we recommend a varied diet? And it was very interesting. I get like 2 reasons, and then people would struggle and struggle. There's about 8 different reasons. And one of them is to avoid excessive exposures to things that are in some foods that are where the food may overall be quite beneficial for you, but where excesses of the food can be detrimental. And it may be, for example, only under certain circumstances. So I gave you the example of people eating cabbage, or turnips, another one, where they're eating only that. That may be where we see the effect and really manifested. But that doesn't mean nothing's happening prior to the development of that serious outcome. And so there's a lot of different foods here, many of which we eat every day, but they do have materials in them that are not good to eating. So I just said this, so I don't have to have you read it. So now, what about the issue of the timing of exposure? When someone is thinking about if they was it works, for example, at one point they wanted to check on an indication that was coming out in the literature that women who were exposed to diethylstilbestrol during pregnancy, thalidomide during pregnancy, there were a very infrequent birth of children with abnormal short arms, no arms, or deformed short arms and legs were also possible to be involved. And a case report was published where someone had 2 births in his delivery practice, which is, of course, is not a very large number of babies, so he thought this was very unusual, went back to the record, and both women had thalidomide, and he raised a question about it, and that started the ball rolling for people to investigate it. But one of the things is, lots of people in his practice had gotten thalidomide. So only 2 people had a baby that was deformed. So the question is, does the timing of exposure matter? And in some cases, it might be something you're exposed to before pregnancy. In this case, it had to be in the first trimester, as I recall. And others, it may be that it has to be really persistent before you see big effects. And I don't know if I've ever seen one that only had an effect postnatally. Generally speaking, any of the drugs that you hear about as being very detrimental to the baby, the dose that's gotten in pregnancy is what's critical. And that what is gotten postnatally is not. And that's been able to be shown in some animal studies where they do the exposure postnatally, and in some human studies where you can distinguish babies who were exposed prenatally but not postnatally because there was no breastfeeding, and you can compare them to children who were exposed prenatally but also postnatally and see if there are differences. So there are ways to study it without intervening, and you're doing a randomized control trial, which you can't really easily do during pregnancy or lactation. And among the things that you can see is that the timing of exposure may determine whether the effect is reversible or not, because some things, especially if it's early in pregnancy, they may alter developmental processes that go on to cause something that's going to happen, let's say, in puberty of the child. And once you've set on that path, there's no reversing it. In other cases, that's not true. You have something that's ongoing, let's say the development of a certain organ, and if it doesn't happen early, it can also happen later, and then it would be considered reversible. It does matter if structure versus metabolism is affected. Because if it affects structure, you can't go back and recreate structures. But if it's affecting metabolism, making someone, for example, insulin resistant, you might be able to reverse that. That's a function. And then you have sometimes exposures where we're concerned that we see an effect on the mother, and that this effect may influence, for example, whether she can properly breastfeed. And there would be some things that can happen in utero to a female that might affect the way in which the breast develops in utero from the primordial cells that make the breast, and if that's set awry, then she may have difficulty with lactation because she doesn't have the tissues that she needs for it. In some cases, you don't have any effect on the mother, but you do have an effect on the child. I think I mentioned that. And then when you have one where you may have used a drug or substance for a very long time without seeing any effects, and the reason is that it affects the child's development later in life, the onset of some disease, condition, or limitation. If you have exposure before pregnancy, you can have effects on the formation of the gamete in females, which starts in utero. I mean, this is amazing. You have 3 to 4 million follicles present in each ovary at birth. And if you realize the ovaries are so tiny and they have that many follicles in them. Ovarian damage from chemotherapeutic agents is greater in girls after puberty rather than before, but nevertheless it can happen before. Spermatogenesis takes about 87 days, 75 days for stem cells to differentiate into sperm, and 12 days for sperm to reach the vas deferens, where they could be moved out of the body. So what are some of the typical effects at different stages of pregnancy? Before implantation, when the egg has been fertilized but it hasn't yet implanted, if something truly adverse happens, it's likely not to implant. But you can have implantation and the beginning of embryogenesis, which lasts about 2 months. And if that's affected, even though there's been implantation, you get fetal loss. And if you don't lose the fetus, it may be that you have enough defects in the baby to make it, very much abnormal. But if it continues to grow, you may not get fetal loss. And then the fetal period, typically would have abnormalities of growth, abnormalities of certain functions, and then later on they'd be manifested as behavioral deficits. So here's a detailed slide to show you what happens before 8 weeks. This is marked I put in for 8 weeks. And it shows here that in the first 2 weeks, the most likely outcomes are death of the embryo, or what we call spontaneous abortion. So if you have damage this early, the pregnancy is likely not to go on. But if it's after that, you start to be able to have the pregnancy continue despite the fact that the baby may be significantly affected. So very early from here on, the baby, if the baby is not getting, in this case, neural tube defects, the vitamin levels that can affect it, you can have neural tube defects developing along the way here. And later on, those same things can result in mental retardation, even if there was no neural tube defect. I don't know what some of these abbreviations stand for, but here you see that the development of the heart is occurring before this level, and so the heart abnormalities might be significant there. This is the consequence of thalidomide. That's the name of the conditions where limbs are not properly or grown at all, and upper limb continues to be vulnerable later, and the lower limb as well. And then cleft lip and hair lip, I guess, are affected also in this period. And when you think about it, this is a period you're unlikely to think you're pregnant, and all of these things may result from things you're exposing yourself to, or someone else is exposing you to without you knowing it. And then you have these, cataracts and glaucoma in the newborn, enamel hypoplasia and staining. And which one of the antibiotics does that? Not penicillin. Shout one. Tetracyclines. That's right. And they can have kids who are exposed in utero to tetracyclines can end up with a brown stain across their teeth. Interestingly, when I was pregnant with my daughter, I was very early in pregnancy, and I had this incredibly bad cold, and I was very sick, and I went to the doctor, and he said, it's obvious you have a bacterial infection, so I'll write you a prescription. You wrote the prescription. And I said, I'm trying to get pregnant, but I'm not sure if I am. And he tore up the prescription and wrote a different one. And afterwards I thought, I mean, for heaven's sake, I was in my 20s, that he wouldn't think that I might be pregnant and he'd write a prescription for something that wouldn't be good if I were. And I was. So I avoided the problem because I spoke up. And then here you have effects on the genitalia for females, masculinization of the female genitalia. And that continues to, the genitals continue to be vulnerable to developmental problems further into pregnancy. But gee, I mean, this just covers everything you want to make sure you would have optimal. I'm lecturing till 5, right? Want to take a break? Want to take a break there?
Yeah, let's take a 10-minute break.
Okay. I see a couple of yawns and rolling eyes.
The dose makes the cabbages, spinach, everything poisonous.
Well, if you get high enough, manifest the same symptoms.
I thought it was during development of the spinach, maybe putting up some not organic stuff to make it fresh.
Organic, not organic, what it has to do with, generally speaking, is whether they use pesticides, and pesticides are a much, tiny problem. And it's interesting that, yeah, and the thing is, I don't know, I've never looked into what it is.
Yeah.
Who's the class representative for this class? You are, and there's another person. Oh, okay, so Joe is also a class rep. He didn't introduce himself before. But that's him. So you guys have two. Yeah? You guys remember that on Friday is the New York Academy of Sciences conference, and it's at the Sackler Institute downtown. So it's like right off the old World Trade Center. It's actually looking down at the footprints of the old World Trade Center. So it's, you know, a longer train ride from here, so give yourself time. And that train is really crowded going downtown at like between 8 and 9:30 in the morning because everyone's going down to Wall Street. I think you get off at the Wall Street stop. Yeah. What time does it start? 8:30. 8:30? You got it's a big new one of the new buildings, right? After the bombing of the Trade Center, and so you walk in and there's kind of a lot of high security, and they have to sign you in, and then you go up to like the 40th floor. Bring your cameras. It's an amazing. You have like almost a 360 view of the entire city. It's the best view. Someone asked about what to wear. Don't wear like your Columbia Nutrition t-shirt or something. Dress kind of business casual, like what Brianne's wearing is nice. Yeah, something like that. What else? There's one other thing. Oh, TBL Group 10. Who's in group? Does everybody know what group they're in? Have they looked? Okay. What? Okay, we'll look it up. Group 10 is Dagmara, Sheila, Lisa, Maria, Marissa, Joseph, and Richard. And you're also going to have one addition. What is your first name again? Nathan. Nathan's going to be added to your group. TBL Group 10?
I didn't like my own.
Because he wasn't on the list. Check the TBL group on coursework that I posted. If you're not in a TBL, let me know, and I'll add you something. Yeah.
Can you send an email like with details about the New York Academy of Sciences? And are we all meeting up? Are we going in as a group?
I have no idea, you guys. Am I supposed to be? Let's assume that you are now. Do you want to go as a group, or can you get downtown by yourself?
No, I mean, like, are we all sitting together? I can get downtown by myself.
Oh, no. Okay. The Sackler Institute is actually, you guys, don't make me yell louder, please. The Sackler Institute is actually quite small. It's not like this huge auditorium. It's part of the New York Academy of Sciences. They have offices in there, and they have a kind of a larger conference room. I mean, I don't know exactly how they're going to fit all of this, to be quite honest.
It fits a couple hundred people.
I don't know if it's going to be, are they just expected to go down there by themselves, Sally, or is this going to be
As far as I
something?
know.
Huh?
As far as I know.
Yeah. So look it up, Sackler Institute, Google it, get on the 1 train, get off at Wall Street. It's going to be really crowded. And, yeah, I think it's on Greenwich Street, if I remember correctly. Sign in at the front desk. They'll ask you for your ID. Tell them you're going to the Sackler Institute for a conference. That's it. Yeah.
Okay, shall I get started? I just glanced down at the notes I have here, and there is something I think that's interesting I wanted to say. It has been studied of how many conceptions go implant and how many implanted actually survive to pregnancy and so on. And it is really amazing. They find that 22% of conceptions fail to implant, and that 31% of the resulting pregnancies for the ones that did implant end in miscarriage after implantation. So if you do nothing except try to get pregnant, the likelihood is that you will be pregnant. 50% of the pregnancies that happen will not come into being actually a pregnancy probably that's even noticed, but there'll be either a loss of the pregnancy very early or a miscarriage. So I wanted to impress on you the issues of exposures, and I picked up a hand cream when I was a number of years ago first preparing a lecture on toxic exposures, and I read this list of ingredients, and I said, well, water's okay, stearic acid's okay, sorbitol should be okay on the skin, glycerin should be okay, blah 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 blah, and then I came to the phenoxyethanol, and I wasn't sure, so I made note of it. And then I went on and I got to methylparaben and propylparaben right after it, and butylparaben, and I thought, and this was a product described as containing natural herbal extracts. So, methylparaben, which is one of the substance items that they refer to in Food and Drug Law as GRAS, generally recognized as safe. And how many of you think that, therefore, it was tested for safety? Good. Nobody thinks it was tested for safety. Generally recognized as safe are substances that were in the food or drug supply prior to the formation of the FDA, were widely used, and there would have been such a backlash if they tried to get everybody to prove they were safe, but also just the money and the time, clearly was an obstacle that was probably insurmountable. So they had some kind of agreement on things that would be declared generally recognized as safe. I think they had as a fallback position that at some point if they were tested they could be delisted, but they weren't targeted for testing. So methylparaben was generally recognized as safe. It's produced naturally and is found in several fruits, primarily blueberries. There is controversy about whether it or polyparabens are harmful at typical cosmetic concentrations. Studies of breast tumors have shown a buildup of methylparaben in the breast tissue. It's readily absorbed from the GI tract or through the skin. It's hydrolyzed and excreted in urine without accumulating. Acute toxicity studies have shown that methylparaben is practically non-toxic in animals. But studies indicate that when applied to the skin, it may react with UVB light, leading to increased skin aging and DNA damage. Now here's something that was advertised. Someone told me I wasn't loud enough before, and I'm not sure why. This doesn't seem to pick me up. if I am getting too low again, do this so I can get a sense of when that happens. This is a nipple cream that was being sold to women who are breastfeeding. Women sometimes have discomfort in the nipple and it gets dried and cracked, and so they might want to use a cream on it. And this one was specifically for that purpose, but it contained phenoxyethanol and chlorphenicin. Phenoxyethanol is a preservative, which is used in cosmetics and medication, but it's known that it can depress the central nervous system and can cause vomiting, diarrhea, and dehydration in the infant. Now, you would say that the amount that should be left on the breast of a woman when she goes to feed the baby should be very low. But clearly, if you're going to use a cream on your nipples, you would want to use one where you didn't have to worry about that. Chlorphenicin relaxes skeletal muscle and can also depress the central nervous system, and it can cause respiratory depression in infants. So this is a product being sold for use by a woman who's nursing, and it has these potential negative effects on the baby. So now I'm going to go into a little more detail on these 5 substances, and they differ in the ways indicated here. Here's alcohol, which is something that people consume totally voluntarily, even during pregnancy, and even till today, despite the change in knowledge about what the effects can be. Diethylstilbestrol, DES, this is a drug that was given to millions of pregnant women because it was thought to, I think it was prevent preterm delivery. And so they started using it in the 1930s. It went in the U.S. into the 1970s, and in Europe into about the 1980s. DDT was used as a pesticide. It was thought to be a very good one because it was so stable that you could use relatively small amounts because they would stay around a long time. It became absolutely ubiquitous beyond where it was sprayed because it does volatilize and ends up getting deposited more broadly. Then you have PCBs. These were never intended to be sort of set loose in the environment. Typically what they were used for is in things like transformers, where I believe they were used as heat conductors or limiters. And so they would be enclosed inside some equipment where they weren't going to be in the environment. But then what would happen is that equipment would become non-functional. Some workmen would come in and remove it and toss it in the trash, and it would end up in a landfill somewhere, and the PCBs would be leaking out and then changing into various compounds that were even more volatile, and it ended up very widespread. And then PAHs we'll see come from some foods, as I mentioned earlier, for example, barbecue foods, but also from many non-food sources. So what about alcohol use during pregnancy? In the first trimester, you can have a primary effect on cell growth. And in theory, if you have a very sudden high exposure in that first 2 weeks, you might terminate a pregnancy. I don't know if that's ever been studied. But as you go later in pregnancy, you have effects on cell number, and that affects the growth of the brain. Clearly not good. In the second trimester, if you start being exposed to alcohol in that point in pregnancy, with severe alcohol abuse, you might induce a miscarriage. And then in the third trimester, you get continuing effects on the development of the infant, and neurological and growth defects can continue to occur. If you think back on that prior slide with what's happening at what's capable of being altered at different stages of pregnancy, you can see neurologic can be affected all the way through, and the growth of certain organs and tissues are capable of being affected at different stages of pregnancy. But the observed effects do depend. The observed effects in terms of both how often they occur and how severe they are. So a given effect may occur, but with greater severity depending on the amount, frequency, and timing of consumption. And that makes it harder to pin down whether something is having any effect at all. So if you see very big effects from very big exposures, and then you see smaller effects from smaller exposures, eventually you get to effects that only the most diligent examination would ever reveal, but are still there at lower exposures. And then the question is there any level of exposure that's safe? And often you can't really answer that with total certainty. You saw something in one of the presentations about fetal alcohol syndrome, and I have a couple of slides to show you the kinds of features. I mean, it's interesting. I've seen people on the street that I think are affected by fetal alcohol syndrome or fetal alcohol effects, which are somewhat milder. The faces sometimes can be, in a child, kind of cute. They tend to have a wider space here because they have a flattening of the central region of the face. So it's an abnormality of the way the face develops vertically. And that's associated with a smaller nose bridge, so the bone structure is more deep, and a shorter nose. And then this, he mentioned this, the philtrum. I don't know how many of you knew what that was, but that's this indented area here. In these children, that would be flat, so you don't have a philtrum. And that's associated with a thin upper lip, but then, upper lips are variable in thickness, so that isn't a pathognomic indicator that it's from fetal alcohol syndrome all by itself. You have these other signs that you consider as well. When they say short palpable fissures, I believe that's referring to the diameter of the opening here, that's smaller. The epicanthal folds above the eye are not the same as you would expect in this child. And earlobe malformations down here, but also the ear appearing to be somewhat turned on the head is another one. So you don't necessarily see all of these in every child. Now you'll see some pictures. So here's a baby, cute baby, I mean, it has a perplexed expression, but otherwise, if you saw a baby like this, you'd say, oh, that cute little boy. And then, but the eye openings are small. This space is rather large. This is rather flat. This is smooth. The upper lip is noticeably thin. And so this is an example. This is one of where it's drawn. These somewhat differences in the eyes, I think, are also typical. That may be presenting a sign as well that the eyes are. You see it in this lower image too. I think this eye looks somewhat different from that one. But the midline here and here, again, in the thin lips are apparent. And here's one where I think both of these people are meant to be illustrative. So it's not just babies that show this, The terrible thing is that fetal alcohol syndrome is really common, and you have, more than one birth per 1,000 is a common thing. So a lot of births per year end up being affected in this way. But that's if you depends on how broad you go into the signs and whether you just go for the syndrome or the effects, which are milder. So that would influence how many children you think are affected. So despite its severe effects, alcohol use during pregnancy is still viewed with indifference in many cultures. And nevertheless, you can go back, I believe it's to the first volume of the Bible, the First Testament, where they say, I think that the prohibition was that once a woman was married, she could not consume alcohol. And you have to realize at that time, once a woman was married, she was likely going to be pregnant within the first year. So, as a preventive, people were observant, and they might have understood that women shouldn't be drinking alcohol. There are also reports you can come up with from the 1400s and 1500s where people comment on the poor quality of the children of women who were drinkers, particularly heavy drinkers. But nevertheless, in many cultures, it's still thought that everybody drinks alcohol, and as long as you're not blotto, it's really okay. I once saw a film that was made in Ireland, which was maybe 8 years ago or so, and the storyline was about a young woman the story was about a young woman. And in the story, she is drinking all the time. She's going to the pub and getting really drunk regularly. And at one of these times, she ends up stumbling into the parking lot, and she runs into the father of a girlfriend. And she's like, So he ends up having sex with her against a car while she is essentially vertically unconscious. and she ends up pregnant. So you can imagine, what was I thinking all through this movie? While we're coming to the point where she's going to deliver the baby, I'm just cringing. And it had nothing to do with the story at all. She continued to drink all through the pregnancy in this movie. Maybe it's part of the culture. But to me, that I don't remember any of the rest of the story, because all I was thinking about was, what's going to happen with this baby. But in some cultures, drinking is very common, and young women may be particularly sort of unconcerned, not thinking that they might get pregnant. She clearly wasn't intending to get pregnant, but she was at a point in her life that when she realized she was pregnant, and of course she was Catholic, so you don't end up getting an abortion, which in other places might have happened. Yes?
Have there been studies done to look at these populations where their heavy drinking is common to see if there is more fetal alcohol syndrome?
I don't remember if I've ever read them. I just assume that if they were, they see it. Did someone want to ask the same question? Was there another question up there? No? Okay. So that would be an interesting thing to check. I'm sure you guys could do it in a minute. And then, now we have the issue of recreational drug use. And I've been really concerned about the changing laws on marijuana. I think that, what we know about what marijuana's effects might be, and also what they might be as marijuana has changed, because we might have experience that was with marijuana that was very different from what's being sold now, and also being taken in through the nasal exposure. Now it's going into the intestine. I don't know that the products of marijuana are the same taken in those two ways, et cetera, et cetera. But many, many other drugs are used other than marijuana or alcohol, and often with inadequate thought about what the effects may be on a baby. Now, the next one I'm going to talk about is diethylstilbestrone, and like alcohol, but even in a more dramatic way, it shows that long use of a substance during, when people are pregnant, with many people getting away with it without obvious effects that they can identify, doesn't ensure that it's safe. Starting in 1938, it was given to pregnant women to prevent miscarriages. They estimate that up to 10 million women and their offspring were exposed during the period that it was being used. This is what amazed me. In 1953, published research showed that it did not prevent miscarriages or preterm births. So now at that point, you would think that the word would go out to people caring for pregnant women and to telling those caregivers, don't use this anymore. It isn't effective and it has no benefit. And who knows, it might even be harmful. But that wasn't the consequence. In the U.S., it continued to be prescribed for almost 20 more years, and in Europe for almost 30 more years. Here's what they found out was happening. And this is how it was discovered. In a local area, they identified an increase in vaginal and cervical cancer in young girls. So as I remember, they had cases of girls like 7 or 8 years old who were developing cancer of the reproductive organs. And that is such an unusual occurrence that it raised red flags. So that got people to start looking into whether this outcome and other problems with the reproductive tract were related to the use of diethylstilbestrone. I know people who have been born of pregnancies where this was used and where they have had a number of the problems. I'm going to show you one of the most extreme problems for women on one of the next slides. But you have structural changes of the reproductive tract. That's what I'll be showing you. But infertility is a common one, and that's where you may either not get pregnant at all, or if you get pregnant, you lose the pregnancies very early, or if you don't lose the pregnancy early, you lose them later in pregnancy. So women have repeated spontaneous abortions, which are horrible to have happen to you. And then if they don't lose the baby in a spontaneous abortion, they deliver early, and sometimes very early, and then that's a problem. So you can read the rest about women. With males, there is similar, also effects on the reproductive organs. They're not as, my impression is they're not as severe or common as they are in female offspring. And you know, I talked about things that were very hazardous for the fetus, but not necessarily terribly hazardous for the mother. And this was an example where, for a long time, they thought there was no effect on the mother, but they, at some studies, have shown a slightly increased risk of breast cancer in women who use these during pregnancy. This is an example of what kind of abnormality they found in the uteruses of some of the offspring, where instead of being, you know, a large oval uterus, it was sort of T-shaped and vertical and flat, with abnormalities of various tissues, the tubular glands proliferating into the vaginal cervix and so on, and the uterus being very constricted. This, of course, would make it very difficult to maintain a pregnancy. So DAS was widely used before its harms was recognized. It was later found to be ineffective. The reproductive cancers were the ones that first brought it to light. And with regard to this, I think this is like a dietary supplement, something that didn't have to be demonstrated to be safe or effective. It wasn't safe or effective, and yet it was used in millions of pregnant women. So now here's a different substance. This is a persistent organic pollutant, and it is a pesticide. It is one of the ones that is a pesticide. There's this complex name that results in us calling it DDT. DDT was fat-soluble and very stable and had low water solubility, considered a plus, and its low volatility. Like many of these pollutants, it is a multichloro compound. Some are multibromo, the PBDEs are brominated, and that renders them quite stable. And that stability can make them ubiquitous over a period of time. So these other examples are examples of these polychloro organic compounds, or polybromo. DDT is an example of similar compounds that, because of their persistence and because of their fat solubility, and because in some cases of their really widespread use, you end up where everything in the environment gets polluted with them. I mean, initially you start having the stuff come off of the ground in rainwater and washing into the ocean, but then you have some volatilization both from the land and water, and then that carries it further and it precipitates down in other areas. And so the levels in ocean water or rivers or lakes may be relatively low, and here it's showing it as, I don't know why this won't work, as 0.04 parts per million. And then you have the fish of those water bodies that are drinking that water all through their life, and then their levels get higher as they accumulate it in their fat. But then those little fish are consumed by bigger fish, and those bigger fish therefore are feeding on this, whereas those littler fish were feeding on this. So these bigger fish get even more in the course of their life. And then you have the tertiary consumer, which is the bird, the large raptors that feed on the large fish, and their levels get even higher. So these are called the tertiary consumers. Humans are tertiary consumers. I mean, we probably would eat the bird, but if we don't eat the bird, we certainly eat the big fish. And so concerns about the chemicals in the fat of big fish is an issue. And the same process could be shown to you for exposure to mercury through fish. That if you eat things like sardines, tiny little fish, or if you eat small versions of big fish when they're very small, they would have low levels because they wouldn't have time to accumulate as much. But if you eat the big fish, like tuna and shark and so on, then you're going to be, you're eating at the top of the food chain and you'll get more. And mercury itself is an element, but it's formed in ocean water and stuff as an organic compound, dimethyl mercury. Polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, these are formed during combustion of pretty much any organic material. I've listed all the fuels there: coal, oil, gasoline. Food is even used as a fuel when you burn waste. Obviously, people burn wood and garbage, and candles. And when I started studying this area, I never again lit a candle in my house. I just thought, why would I do this? I mean, there's some minor benefit from having the candle burning, to create some atmosphere or whatever. And but to realize that what you're doing is within a closed environment, you're giving off PAHs, and then it's going to stay in the house. The other thing about this, and maybe this is better to bring up later when I talk about prevention, but one of the things that I do regularly right through the winter is I ventilate my house. And so at some time, I work at home. At some point, I open all the sliding doors. I have 5 of them. And I open all the windows, and my house, which may be kept at, say, maybe it's 68 degrees, it may fall to 63 over a period of 2 hours, and then I close everything up, and if the heat is on, the heat starts heating up the house. But I do it because I know that the most polluted air you breathe is in the place you live in. And so to actually bring in the outside air, even when it's not great air like in New York City, that's better than what you have in your house. So what do PAHs do? They form adducts with DNA. So I'll let you think about that for a little while. So you're sitting next to that burning candle, and the substance is going in your lungs and going in your blood and going in your tissues and connecting to some of your DNA and splitting it. So you get DNA breaks. You can measure the exposure to PAHs as the amount of DNA that has adducts, PAH adducts on it. That's actually measurable. I worked for a number of years when I was working on the World Trade Center study I think I told you about. I was working at the Children's Environmental Health Center of Columbia University, which is a center focused on these issues of exposures in children. And I must tell you, it was a very depressing place to work and to hear about all these things that kids and fetuses are exposed to. But one of the woman who runs it, Ricky Pereira, has been working on PAHs and their effects and how to lower them and so on for many, many years, and started with measuring these adducts very early on. Exposure is associated with cancer of a number of tissues and organs, and has been picked up, increased cancers of those types were picked up in exposed workers, again, showing you that's one of the ways we find out those are dangerous. But it also is associated with other diseases. Recent results are showing a relation of cord blood PAHs with later obesity. There are other compounds, fat-soluble compounds, that have been linked in this way, and it's becoming an area of great attention. But here's a slide from the Children's Environmental Health Center where they're focusing on PAHs, and they looked at children at age 5 and age 7, where they had measured ambient air PAH measurements in the prenatal period. This was done by having pregnant women wear on their back a backpack with a little air pump in it. The air pump pulled the air through a filter that collected PAHs, and they did that for 2 days during pregnancy. So they had a measure for each woman in their study of her daily exposure to PAHs indoors and outdoors. At night, she was to leave the pump by her bedside, put it on when she got up. So they had that, and this is the ambient air PAH. And then they're showing the adjusted mean BMI as the PAH level in the air during pregnancy went up. And that was true at age 5 and 7. You also see the change in BMI from age 5 to age 7. Quite significant there too. And this was adjusted for a number of other things. So that's a recent sort of growing concern that some of the causes contributing to a rise in obesity may be exposures to these general compounds. PAH is a hazardous waste, and there are many sites that are classified as hazardous waste sites that are listed by Environmental Protection Agency. And there are over 1,300 of them that are considered seriously contaminated. At least 600 of those have been identified as having high levels of PAHs. There are over 100 different forms of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. If you think of hydrocarbons, very general term, aromatic limits it a bit more, but polycyclic is a bit more, and you have many, many different forms, and a lot of them are reasonably anticipated to be carcinogenic in humans. And these sites are on the national priorities list and targeted for long-term cleanup. And periodically, you may see in your environments, perhaps in other states as well as locally, where a site is declared cleaned and a lot has been done to clean it up. It is a national calamity how many there are. Okay, so let's move on to PBDEs. Here you have 209 congeners, polybrominated diphenyl ethers. And these congeners depend on the number and placement of bromine atoms. And each congener has its own half-life. How long does it take for it to degrade by 50% into other things in the environment? They differ from one congener to another. This is very complicated to study because of this variability and complexity. They've indicated there it's a probable cause of neurodevelopmental and liver or thyroid toxicity and reproductive risk. This was what I mentioned, that the U.S. production of the penta and octa polybrominated compound mixtures, they don't come as pure compounds, they come as mixtures for their industrial uses, and that was stopped here in 2004, but now they're ubiquitous and persistent. Now, I can tell you a story that's very interesting about these. We were measuring them in the World Trade Center cohort, and we measured them in mother's blood and fetal blood. And then we went to do the analyses, and we had both bloods, but not on everybody, so we had a sort of overlap. Some we only had it in the child, some we had it in both, and some we only had it in the mother. And so we were trying to make decisions about whether we would use all the measures or only use the fecal blood or only use maternal blood. And when we were going through the figures of the different hospitals where we had recruited women, we had three hospitals and one birthing center, which had very few births. In one of the hospitals, we had high levels of the PBDEs in the mother's blood, but not in the baby's blood. In both other hospitals, they were completely, they were correlated very high. So I tried to figure out how could that happen. And I ultimately concluded that the reason was the baby's blood was drawn in the delivery room at delivery, and the mother's blood was drawn the following day or the day after that. And she had to have been exposed in the hospital. If she had been exposed any time prior to delivery, it would have been in the baby's blood. We were having our PBDEs analyzed by the CDC, federal government, and they had done the analyses. So I reported to them that I was concerned that the mother had been exposed during hospital stay, and they said no, the blood samples must have been contaminated, and they had to be the way the bloods were collected. So I ended up having multiple arguments with the CDC over this, because the way we had the samples collected, they were collected over time, on all different days, over a period of 6 months. And it was true at the beginning and at the end. They still had this difference. And the mother's blood was collected and picked up shortly after it was drawn, and the baby's blood on a different day by different people was picked up and withdrawn. If there was any way of contaminating them, how would you have it happen only to the mothers and the babies? Because the reason they were fighting me is I was saying I wanted to have the materials in the rooms that women went to after delivery. I wanted to have them tested by the CDC for the PBDEs, and they didn't want to do it. Interestingly, the head of obstetrics in that hospital was willing and eager to have me test. And she said they would take samples of the sheets and the blankets and the curtains that went around the women and so on. And the end result was the total kibosh was put on it. They said it has to be contamination and we're not going to analyze. So we ended up using only the samples for the ones where we didn't have this problem to do our analyses. But I mean, to me, to not have the knowledge that could have come out of that being test being run was just pitiful. But it also told me you can be exposed when you have no idea you're being exposed. And where would you have PBDEs? Well, first of all, in mattresses. And hospitals change their mattresses more frequently, I think, than homeowners do. And if the mattress has polyurethane foam in it, which at one time every mattress did, That's the source of PBDEs. Those polyurethane foam was something like 30% by weight PBDEs. 30% by weight. So if you take a piece, it's like, oh, this whole piece is PBDEs. And what happens to it over time? Have any of you ever had a foam cushion that was really old, and eventually, you know, the thing that was like this, you could take it like this, and it's all friable on the inside of the cushion. You can feel it's like sand instead of like cushion. That's because a lot of the PBDEs have gone off, and what's left isn't really a form. So people are concerned that if you have those that type of furniture in your home, that the PBDEs come out in dust, that they collect on the floor. They say kids are more exposed because they crawl on the floor, and dust is a high source of PBDE in households where it comes within the house. And so, but they also use it as a flame retardant on industrial draperies and other flammable things. So within a hospital setting, that may have been another source of it. But you can see why it's so difficult to get information that's really good. I mean, this was such a chance finding. It was really surprising that we were able to even recognize it. So, just more broadly, you also have concern about substances that might affect eating, and there are things that, for example, may drive you to increase salt intake or protein intake. They may affect absorption of nutrients or metabolism utilization. And then the fact that if materials are fat soluble, and many of the ones I've been talking about are, they get concentrated relative to the woman's body burden. They become higher in breast milk because it's higher in fat, and that increases infant exposure. And then tracking and quantifying exposure to identify risk is very difficult. By the way, when I'm talking about this concentration in fat, while I was waiting for the friend who delayed me, and by the way, I want to apologize about that and introduce her, but she left before I got around to it. She did the master's program with me in the dark ages when dinosaurs roamed the earth, and got her doctorate here as well. And she came in to see, what she would see was different about the class. But she and I went to the wrong room. I went to the 312 where the other classes are, and so we were late. Did I want to say? Oh, yes, about fat. While I was waiting for her, I read an article that I may assign next year, but it's an article that came out of something that years before I had seen at a meeting of experimental biology, and I had talked to the person who did it and said, you got to publish this. This is really valuable. What they did was they used an Ayurvedic medicine technique for detoxifying the body. Now, that's a word I generally really abhor, because people throw it around like we're really toxic and all. But this was a very particular treatment. I don't remember it 100% in detail, but it did involve fasting, consuming ghee, which is a purified butter oil. I think the non-oil part was not in it. And getting massage where they used a very viscous oil on the skin in very large amounts all over the body. And they did this in a seriatim way, a number, let's say 4 or 6 times over a period of time, with this total fasting. And what they were observing was that they measured PCBs in the blood before they started treatment and after, and they reduced them by about half. And the guy who was presenting the poster, I said to him, gee, this is very interesting. Had they started with a reason for using this and all? And he said, no, I have no idea why this works. I'm not related to him. He's a chiropractor himself. Something just went off, didn't it? Didn't that go off?
Yeah. Sally, why don't you just use the microphone?
What?
Why don't you just use the microphone?
And
You're not really walking
it'll come
around.
on at some point and be blasting, right? So what he said he was a chiropractor. So I said that I thought I completely understood it. Every step made sense to me. That if you're fasting, you start mobilizing fat. So you want to bring the stuff out of fat, you want to mobilize fat. And then the other thing is that you're taking fat in. Normally what's in the blood will get into the intestine but be resorbed. But if you have a high fat inside the intestine, it would tend to be isolated there, just as it is, say, in breast milk when it gets into the fat in breast milk. And then I think they were also using something to induce the equivalent of diarrhea, but not diarrhea, but make you go. And so they were pulling out what they could that way. But at the same time, they were using the thing I said on skin. Skin is porous. And they were doing these full body massages with oil that you're excreting fatty materials to your surface, but you're also bringing them in from your surface. So you're putting this oil on, and it would pull out what was coming out. And then that would be washed off of you. And so eventually it was published, and it was not close to that date. But I now have the article, and I think I will be assigning it if any of you are interested in it. I thought of it as if you ever had any idea that you might have had big exposure and that now, I'm stuck with it. Here it is, it's in my body, I'm going to be getting pregnant. I thought, I would go through a thing like that. Certainly, I don't mind massages at all. The oil is not going to hurt you. Fasting isn't so deadly either. And if it could make a difference in the body burden, I would be supportive of that. And then I just thought I'd point out the issue about medication use during pregnancy. These are data, they're not as recent as I would like, but it does show you that there was an increase between the 70s and the mid-2000s, over 30 years, where the number of women taking 4 medications at any time during pregnancy went from maybe 23% up to 50%. Again, this is an area, and then a significant portion of that are taking them during the first trimester. This is really something where we would want to change this to the extent we could and get it so that only the absolutely essential medications are being used during pregnancy. The problem with taking medications also is that there is a plethora of medications on the market that have multiple ingredients. Often people don't even realize that they are getting stuff. One of the cautions that is given often to parents is that they need to watch things that contain caffeine. So many medicines contain caffeine now, and then if you add that to what kids get in soda, and then some of them may be drinking coffee and so on, they may be getting really high doses of caffeine just because it's in a variety of products. But that's true for other ingredients beside caffeine. Merck makes an estimate that 90% of pregnant women use an over-the-counter or prescription drug, so very few women are avoiding all medications. Now, I have found that when people learn that I'm interested in this issue of exposure, that I worked in the Environmental Health Center, they would start talking to me about what they try to avoid and how concerned they are. And it struck me, and I've seen it now mentioned in articles as well, that people worry more about exposures that they can't control themselves than they do about exposures that they can. So they'll be complaining about what people are putting on food and the pesticides being used and how the food isn't handled and kept clean the way it's being handled and stuff like that. And then, they're drinking alcohol, they're taking illegal drugs, they're taking medications for symptoms that are either tolerable or that you can deal with non-medication approaches. They don't consider anything about their household chemicals. I mean, the number of different chemicals that people use in the household, and that they advertise on TV. I mean, just sit for a few hours looking at ads on TV, and when they come up, say to yourself, do I really need Febreze on my cushion, sprayed into the air of my house? I mean, what's happened is that I've heard that that's toxic to dogs, and they show dogs climbing on them, but that people who are concerned about animals say if you have a dog in your house, don't use Febreze because it's really hazardous to them, and that may depend on whether they're a tiny dog that gets a big dose relative to its size versus a big dog where the dose might be smaller. But then, things like herbal remedies where you don't know what the ingredients are and you treat it as if it's got to be safe because it's herbal, but meanwhile you're worrying about whether someone is burning something that's poisoning, the air 5 apartments up. So if you are thinking about yourself and thinking about what you can do, I would implore you to start by thinking of the places where you can have an effect. So rather than just overwhelming yourself with this sense of there's nothing you can do, there's so many people out there and they're doing such bad things to the environment, I can't do anything about it, focus on the ones where you can, because there's a lot that most people can do to reduce their exposures. So I would say limit your exposure to common, non-essential pollutants and use fewer products. Go through all the things you have in your medicine cabinet, all the things you have in the cabinet where you keep the cleansers, and say which of these are really necessary and which of them are harmful. So for example, water is a very good cleaner. If you want to use water, that's pretty safe. Bar soap is pretty safe. It's basically an alkali with a fat and linked together. Then you start going beyond that. Well, bleach is pretty safe. At least it's a very simple mixture of, it's usually sodium oxychloride, and that's in it. It's a single compound, and you can use small amounts of that. Then you start going beyond that and ask yourself, do I need it? And if I need it, how often do I need it? So maybe you use some kind of polish on your furniture. Do any of you polish your furniture anymore? Probably not. But that's an example of something, people would do that twice a week. And if the thing smells like it's an organic compound, it has stuff in it, and you want to know whether that's safe to be putting on a table, putting on every bureau, and having that vaporize into the air over time. So that's one of the things to do right off. And then B, the other thing that I think is really important and where we don't have enough people doing anything is be proactive and support policies that reduce exposures through foods or the environment. When these things come up as bills being put in by some congressperson to change what's available or how a label has to be indicated, or to strengthen the FDA, which comes up periodically. I mean, you've got waves of this happening where it's defunded, it's refunded, it's defunded. Write to your congressperson, give a call. Those are supposed to be very effective because so few people do it. And then the other piece of it is, don't rest thinking that if you fix it here, if it's fixed here, it's not a problem anymore, because pollution affects you worldwide. And what's being burned in countries in Asia now, what's happening with windstorms in Africa where sand is blown loose, it ends up being measurable across the ocean in other countries. So we really are one world, and we should be taking the approach that if we can be the spokesperson somewhere else for saying, yes, we know this is dangerous and we've outlawed it in the U.S., and by you having it here, you're bringing down, these consequences, and you shouldn't. Be willing to speak up, because that's what's going to make the difference. So, if there are any questions, we have time for them. Yes?
So how exactly, do you know what the process is for people to get rid of, these pollutants when they're trying to get them out of, their house or there's, a specific way to do it?
How to get rid of things like the PBDEs in the couch?
What's the factors that you have to go through safely?
Every time you go to do it, you should probably go online and ask, because what's important changes with time. But for example, there are different standards for fire retardants, where you can get fire retardants that aren't PBDEs. That's happened more recently. I changed my mattress about a year ago, and I went and asked for only mattresses that did not have polyurethane in them. And I was able to identify some that didn't. So that's on a personal level. That was the way I did it. But obviously, can you throw out a mattress, a perfectly good mattress, and change it? You're probably not going to do that. With respect to smaller things than that, you might look at, if you have cushions in the house, check to see if they're polyurethane inside, and if not, if they are, you might want to get rid of them and change them to some other kind of filling, fabric, or cotton batting or something.
Can you just throw it away, or wouldn't that even risk further polluting?
She's asking if you can just throw it away. If it's hazardous stuff, do you just throw it away? And that's, a really good question. It's one of the reasons for supporting recycling, because recycling takes in the different types of plastic and treats them differently if it's done correctly. In my area, I'm in New Jersey, I have so little garbage at the end of 2 weeks it may be this much in the pail. I bury my vegetable material. I collect it in the kitchen and bury it in the yard. And they collect all metal, glass, plastic, and paper of any kind, and they collect all of them together except the paper is separate from the others. So everything is getting recycled. And that's what you want, because if these products are being made, but they can be put into a stream where it's safer, that's good. The other thing I would say is drinking out of plastic water bottles. I mean, have you seen the ad on the TV that shows that in 1 year we produce enough plastic water bottles to go around the world? I think they say 3 times, but maybe 30. And a very large portion of them don't end up being recycled. So reducing the use of plastic, it's very hard. I have 2 grandchildren, and all through their childhood I would walk in and see all the plastic toys that were bought for them, and getting toys that are not plastic when an alternative is available. Sometimes there's something like Lego blocks. You're going to get them, they're going to be plastic. But there are so many things that don't have to be plastic that are. That's another way. Just trying to reduce and reduce, not just for your own exposure, although that's a big motivation, but because you can be contributing to it in the world. So, and for every item that you can think of, you have to go through some kind of educational process to decide, is this something I actually can do something about? So now, at one time people said, oh, there's nothing about plastic bottles. Well, people started carrying aluminum ones and glass ones because they said, I don't want to be one of the people who is always buying a plastic bottle to drink. I will refill the bottle in the sink and carry it with me, and it will be a plastic bottle. So when the mindset starts to change, the possibilities increase. Any other questions? How many of you can name something that you avoid because you think that it's detrimental, either environmentally or to you personally? If you're thinking, can I think of anything like that? Raise your hands. Okay, so not many. So we have a long way to go here. There are a lot of people who can start thinking about their contribution to their own health from their exposure to things that they don't have to be exposed to, or reducing their exposure to, and contribution to the environment. We have been headed in a direction which is not sustainable. And it may take some big changes to get to a sustainable place, but any changes we make in the meantime will be improved. Okay, thanks for your attention. You want to see it? You want to see it?
Could I?
Yeah.
A friend who's actually messing with it, I think. The 2 of us would be interested.
I picked up the wrong pile. I thought I was picking up the assigned readings, and these were others that I thought were interesting, but I never got to putting them in.
Can I get one of those, the article about the Ayurvedic treatment?
Well, that's it.
I'll take a picture of it.
Okay, awesome.
Find it up. It's on PubMed.
I hope so.
Thanks.
And can you give?
Yeah.
Oh, you gonna take your own picture?
Yeah, could you do that?
So, a quick question. I know that a lot of the different mentors haven't given the information to you yet to be put on the
There's
Excel.
not too many more that have agreed. There may be 15 or 20.
Okay.
I've written to them all on the weekend and told them, you said you were interested in getting a student. The students were looking, you don't have a form to you. So, and a number right away, about 4 more sent in for then, but maybe over the next few days more will come in.
Perfect. Do you know if any of them are like obstetricians or deal with like pregnancy directly?
The person who works in OB is Weston. Yes, and someone else presented for her. She didn't do her own presentation, but she has access to a variety of projects and obstetrics. And this is someone else. We used to have two people now. So start with her, and if that doesn't work out.
Thank you.
Hi.
My mentor hasn't responded to me in 4 days.
Who's the mentor?
Dr. Sophia. I can't pronounce her last name. Sophia.
PSI?
She does the HIV, and there is actually another mentor
She does HIV, and Arcadi also works with HIV in children. There's there are a number of people who do work on HIV, if that's really interesting. But I'll re-email her.
Should I also email the other mentor as well?
You can interview.
Because I can interview.
She's not co-mentoring someone, is she?
I think she is. In her presentation, there's 2 people listed.
Then what you can do is take the email you already sent her, forward it to her again and to the colleague, and say to her, I'm wondering if you have any chance to speak with me, as you see, I previously emailed you. And that way, if you pick up that her co-mentor contacts you, the co-mentor may say to her, "You're too busy, I'll call the girl," and then it'll happen. So yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
All right?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and that's a good setting.
It's interesting you mentioned the plastic bottles. So I was it's a toxicology and environmental health program. And
This is where undergraduate?
Undergraduate, yeah, it was at UC Davis.
Okay.
And also like in Berkeley, whenever we have like ecology talks or seminars like that, everyone brings a reusable bottle. And if you ever have a plastic bottle, you'll feel like sorry.
I hope to change that. You can't imagine me. Yeah. You guys probably grew up in a world where everybody used plastic bottles. I did not. And I remember when I made toast for this class, when I went to Europe in the 50s, and when I went to France and they served olive oil, I thought, my God, I think we're in a developed country. They don't even have water. And it was true. The reason they were drinking bottled water was they didn't have a reliable water system. So they got to be this old posh stuff. But when I started seeing people drinking bottled water here, I thought, I'm saying that our water is good. And I had a completely opposite view of what's become common. So when I go to a restaurant and they say to me, you want still or bubbly water? I say tap water. I don't want bottled water. And for a long time when we were drinking it, bottled water was regulated. So when they measured it, it was high level tap water. And the tap water is highly regulated and tested every day.
Exactly.
So.
And also the plastic. Now they did study even cold, if the water's cold. The stuff, the plastic inside.
And interestingly, put that together with the fact that you would pay, the idea that you would pay for water. It's like, you never do it, you play urine tank. I'd be an college of physicians and surgeons at the time who did urine tank, so that's why I saw it. But it is about the time when you're not allowed to pay without paying. In order to go into that, you have to pay. And people who don't have money have a problem with finding a place to pay. So I go, we have to get into where you have to pay to drink. Even in farm versus I think we're all being because they all just seems absurd. Because, I can afford to pay for water, but for many people, the idea that they're paying for water is just absurd. I think it's hot. I know it's hot. And it's hot. When you think of what you need to drink in a day, if you drink a bottle of
like I guess coming to meet with you or discussing?
Okay, is there something we can discuss?
I guess. Well, I don't know. I have like some ideas that interests of mine, and I wanted to discuss with you if there are.
And you haven't been able to tell by looking through the interests?
Yeah.
What is this? Give me an example.
Well, two of my interests are physiology and sports medicine. Exercise physiology.
Rosendale was one from the recently said he had changed his plans.
That's what you see. Sorry, I drove from home to my family likes to drive straight there. And
70 years of Sharon. Sharon's a big inspiration of everybody who's working training here.
Okay.
And the biggest thing like
Okay, and then a second topic that I thought I was maybe interested in, if it's possible, is like healthcare
but like
economics.
the areas
Industry, like more like healthcare industry stuff.
where my grandparents
You know, I looked up like some faculty. I know there's some faculty and mailmen and
And
I was
when we spoke,
and where my grandparents live, it's like
she's there person in biostats, she's interested in using data to answer questions. She might want to go with project being developed.
yeah, but my mom would say like it's not.
So the
biggest thing that she would say
you
was
have
that
in her present to make information.
So that's been that's been the biggest thing because for my family I'm not
You have any?
Oh, yes, are you guys?
Yeah, I speak for her. Sometimes students come to me, they don't know than I do.
biggest policy change, which is not good.
Okay, so there are people that speak about health and math and creations like that.
It's not.
But you could start thinking about where
Like my grandparents say,
is this data that has a federally available data available.
That's it.
And you have to identify
and now
surveys of pregnancy, delivery data, hospitalization data, and there are surveys of pregnancy and women with children under age 5.
Yeah, and it just
all of them provide data sources and provide data sources that furnish the pregnancy and breastfeeding period. I can find questions that I can answer. I'm sure there's a completely parallel literature.
Same thing there. Like, somebody built a pool.
But I tell you,
And it's a gravel. And so it's never filled. And when you fill it once, and like we make fun of him
I
because
tell you,
it
just
was
instead of
to get all that water.
see, if you could sit down or librarian or annual
And so
research
his house
and identify some of the types of data or stimulating think questions that you want to ask. So that you can say, I look at the literature, some of the things that came to mind is not into it.
That's why I haven't met.
And then once you get, you put more and you start working on it, it has concepts to there. Let's say they decide, oh, the very thing I want to look at is the different costs of treating this one particular cancer when it occurs in the eventual development. And I find out so we go to some of the research that way, and then they say, why don't you look more broadly about cancers of the heart and then in that way you gradually when you're doing what you want to do, that's part of the because it was made available, which is a big part of the problem with getting answers to questions.
I emailed myself some people that I like just did a search of, so I have some names.
And are any of them members? Good. Do you know this one?
Yeah.
I have a question. So in studies that you mentioned, when they had the outcome of the men that had like the trees for fertility and they ended up having more female offspring, I was wondering if they did like, do they know why that was? Like, why was that intended, or is that just like an observation they made? They didn't look deeper into it.
I don't believe they went any further into it, but I think it would be kind of amusing that kids to the more what would be mechanistic, why they have more girls is that the sperm that was female survived and fertilized the egg and when it was returns to males. And why that would be, it might be in a lot of ways, it's interesting. You could say, you know, women in the world, there are more than a lot. There are even more than because men dying off. The ratio is less different. From fertilization on, the males implant as well. They get more eggs carry, more. It's not a defect. It's probably that you get some extra protection from that full chromosome.
Yeah.
X.
Yeah, there is.
That's probably nobody's, you know, I don't know that that's proved it, but that you make, when you learn that more chromosomes doing, you suppose you think of the next fertilized
So, these are some faculty that I identified in different schools at Columbia. This person, Dr. Sankat, he didn't know that I saw his research interest because healthcare policy management, the NIH funding that we went to that was really nice.
The one problem with getting very, very large master's program.
Yes.
And all the judges are used. So that, even if we were willing to approach.
Okay. These people were from business schools. But,
How are you?
these four were all from business school.
I'm really happy to hear that putting coconut oil in my skin is not going to be
Well, that's a good, yeah,
That's a takeaway.
a great takeaway message.
I have to push. See you even do 1 hour.
Okay. Okay, and then ask Sharon about
Even after that,
sport.
give her insight on it.
Sure.
Even on the health policy, which was something I didn't think of.
Okay.
You know, we go through, we have so many mentors, it's hard. And I'm bad at this, keeping track of who's doing what. She's much better. So that could be helpful.
All right,
Okay,
thank you.
what next?
Hi, tubing. I'm going to talk to you a little bit of the policy stuff for the toxicology topics, and then I'd like to talk a little bit about mentors as well.
Okay.
So I was wondering, it seems like a reoccurring thing about like toxic substances in not only food or in the environment seems to be like, you know, you find out one thing, it's really bad for you, like PBDEs or something, right? And then, you know, you go through a very difficult process to take it out or ban it or whatnot. That's already not easy. And then what happens is...
They take something else and bring it in.
Exactly!
Well, we have to change the default to where you can't manufacture and distribute something without showing it's safe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, for example, I mean, there are some systems in which you build in a way of the product getting recycled, so that the manufacturer is responsible for the recycling.
Right.
But, you know, that doesn't work for everything either. The other thing is there's a movement beginning, maybe underway, of designing for its destruction. That is, to start saying, if this chair has a cushion in it that has something bad in it, we shouldn't make this cushion this way.
But what's the push for manufacturers to
That's,
do that?
in part, that could be regulatory, where you set up regulations that say, I mean, it's hard to jump to the final, but, you know, if you had regulations that said that any new manufacturing process that was going to incorporate a new substance would have to demonstrate its safety, that would work. I mean, but I mean, how could you get that past Congress? So you might have to do it in very small steps, and which would be unsatisfactory for a long time, but would be better than nothing.
A step for it. And I feel like the same thing happens to foods. I mean, we identified trans fats, we identified certain things, but they're just
I never thought that they would get to eliminate trans fats.
That's
I was
amazing.
astonished.
Right.
And you know, I was listening to some program on the radio, and they mentioned something, and it reminded me of something that happened many years ago, which was I was a chemist. This was very early in my career. I think it was about 1958. And I was reading the American Chemical Society Journal. At that time, that was what I read. And there was articles in it about how they were requiring people to take the sulfur dioxide out of the smokestacks that were burning stuff in industry and releasing it into the air, and sulfur dioxide was one of the products. And that was what caused what they referred to as acid rain. So it had gotten to where the wind blew the smokestack's fumes, the forests below were turning completely dead in areas because they got heavy rainfall of essentially sulfuric acid, sulfurous or sulfuric. And so there had been a movement progressing that we wanted to get this, it had to be taken out. And what the journal's articles were talking about was how it was going to destroy industry, because industry would have to devote millions of dollars to scrubbers on these smokestacks, and that they couldn't possibly produce their products economically viably if they had to take out the sulfur dioxide. And I'm reading it, I'm just a 20-year-old girl, new in my field, reading the big journal of the field. Gosh, I wonder what we're going to do, you know, if that happens. And then the law passed. And I would say that in a year, I was reading articles about how they were removing the sulfur dioxide, converting it to sulfuric acid, and selling it as a commercial product and making a profit.
So they'll figure it out.
And I said, those effing lies. All this time, they put it off, and they ruined, you know, huge areas of land, saying, oh, it's going to wipe us out. And then as soon as they had to do it, they made money. So every now and then I go back to that in my mind when they say, for example, now the argument is, if we started to insist upon more reusable fuels like sunlight and ground, you know, geothermal energy and wind energy, we're going to wipe out the economy. They'll figure it out. And you know what's already happened, which you know partially proves the precept here, is that as they mandated that some of the electric power had to come from recyclable sources, the cost of, for example, the ones that collect solar panels, the cost of them has plummeted. Because if there's a big market, people jump in and they find cheaper ways of producing. And to me, that's like, oh, that's right out of the SO2 handbook. Yeah, it's exactly the same.
And the bigger companies, or the more traditional energy companies, are not buying the
Yes.
new energy startups.
Yes. But meanwhile, you know, you have this potential now where they're developing solar panels that are essentially like a piece of paper. You know, they're somewhat thicker than a piece of paper. But there are some I've heard that you can use it for your whole roof. Yeah. There are some they're saying you can make the side of the building can be, instead of siding, it can be made of this stuff and it protects the building and insulates it, but meanwhile it collects the solar energy. So what do you get? You get people saying, oh, I can put solar panels on my roof and I can collect more energy than I use and I can feed it back to the grid. And industry's fighting that. They don't want it to come back to the grid because then they are essentially not getting any money from that buyer. Right. That buyer is getting their own energy free and getting money from the...
They're no longer a consumer.
That's right. And they are the industry is paying them for it.
Right.
So my view is they have to come up with an arrangement where, for example, if you pay 10 cents per kilowatt hour, they will give you 5 cents for every kilowatt hour you give them. So then when they use it for somebody else, they get 10 cents, they've only paid you 5. Yeah, they're still making a profit. But then, making those regulations happen is a battle, and that's why I say when these things come up in Congress, people have to speak up, because some things can be done right now that are simply not being done because people aren't in the right place at the right time to make it happen.
But what you bring up is a very good point, that you're bringing up economic feasibility, right? And in a lot of policy, just because it makes sense or it's scientific or ethical or it's good for people and the environment, that's only just a small part. If it's not economically feasible or politically.
But then I'm arguing with you as well that what's economically feasible changes when you make laws change.
Yes.
And that people find ways of making money the new way.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
that's very positive. In many ways, that's really positive. That you really, I'm not a person that sort of focuses on how to make money, but it's really interesting what can happen when people are freed to make money whatever way the laws allow. And that's one of the reasons I think America has been very successful industrially, or in terms of money making and producing new things, because of our policies that encourage that approach, and that individual people can go in the garage and come up with a computer, and the rest is history.
Yeah. No, this is really good. I mean, what you told me of thinking and processing.
Yeah. And it's not an area where you will get to a point where you'll say, good, I solved it, and now it's over. It's going to be, a continuing battle, but you can have victories along the way. I mean, I've seen a lot of them. For example, when I grew up, I was of a mindset that, there's a variety of reasons that you really couldn't change anything. That was sort of the way things were in my family. You can't change anything. If it bothers you, you have to just accept it. And there was a few things that when they happened, I really began to think that was wrong. That was wrong. One of them was they cleaned up the Lake Erie. Lake Erie was a dead lake. From the pollution that went into it, there was essentially no living fish in it. And then they just put regulations in. They say the lake is dead. How are you going to make it alive? Turns out life is determined. And so, if you make it at all possible, life comes up. And what they did was, within a number of years, not much, they cleaned out the lake by stopping putting stuff in it. And the natural turnover cycle, and the fact that some of it, it comes in and then it goes out. And the lake is now a beautiful, clean lake. So that was one. The other one was when the wall came down. I mean, I had lived through this whole thing of, the communist threat, and the Soviet Union was our big enemy, and this wall, and Berlin being split, and it was like, in the back of your head all the time, and it was unchangeable. And then one day, people went up to the wall. I know all these stories of people going to the wall and being shot, and people trying to get across and being mowed down. How could you have anybody do anything to the wall? And then one day there are thousands of people and they're pulling down the wall and nobody's shooting them. And I thought, who would have ever believed that we could do that? So my sense is that I'm certainly a very poor predictor about what will be able to be done, and I'm not a leader in making things like that happen. But I'm willing to think of opening the doors for all those other people who will go ahead and do it if it becomes possible to do it and make change happen. Yeah. And I see them in the classroom. You see some people who are very, very narrowly focused. And I think I was that way too. And then there were other people who I want to change stuff. I want to change stuff. And I think, God bless. We need them both.
Exactly.
But there really is a lot that can be bettered. Okay? Yeah, good to talk to you.
Yeah. Do you think it's negative when we talk about the uncertainty?
You want to talk in?
Can we?
Yeah, let me see that. what are you looking